Clara Ashworth had never once in her life questioned whether she was kind. She had questioned plenty of other things, whether the lace on her Sunday dress was too narrow, whether the Pattersons down the road had been invited to the Whitmore dinner before or after her family, whether cook had used enough nutmeg in the pudding, but kindness was not something she had ever stopped to examine. She assumed it, the way one assumes the walls of a house are solid. She had never pressed on them to find out. That particular Tuesday morning in September of 1908, she came down the stairs of the Ashworth house at exactly 8:15, dressed in a pale blue walking coat with bone buttons, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a hat with a small green ribbon. She was 23 years old, and she moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had always been told, in various ways, that she was exactly what she should be. The town of Caldwell sat in the gentle folds of a valley in the English countryside, close enough to the larger city of York to feel connected to the wider world, and far enough away to believe that its own opinions were the most important ones. It was a market town, with a square at its center and 4 streets fanning outward like spokes on a wheel. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, the square filled with wooden stalls selling vegetables, cloth, baked goods, eggs, cheese, and the general noise of people who had known each other long enough to have opinions about each other. Clara walked to the market with her friend Louisa Fenwick, who lived 3 houses down and who had the pleasant habit of agreeing with most of what Clara said. Louisa was small and fair-haired, with round cheeks that went pink in the cold, and she laughed easily, which Clara had always appreciated in a companion. They had been shopping for nothing in particular. It was really a walk dressed up as an errand, and Clara was in a good mood, which in her case meant she was especially observant. She noticed the grocer had put his best apples at the front again, which meant last week's were being quietly moved to the back. She noticed that Mrs. Holt was wearing a coat that was at least 3 seasons old, dyed poorly to look newer, and that the dye had not quite taken at the hem. She noticed the farmer from outside town who always sold slightly undersized turnips and called them standard. She did not say these things out loud, not all of them, but she filed them away in the careful ledger she kept in her mind, the one that ranked people and things according to standards that felt, to her, entirely natural. She was pausing at the cloth stall, running a finger along a bolt of deep green wool, when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss." She turned. The man standing behind her was, to her eyes, immediately and clearly out of place. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and his face was well-made, strong jaw, straight nose, steady dark eyes, but everything around that face told a plain story. His jacket was good wool but old, pressed with care but worn at both elbows. His boots had mud on them that had dried in layers, the kind that comes from walking across open fields for several days in a row. His hair was slightly too long for fashion, curling at the collar. He had no hat. He was holding a folded piece of paper loosely in one hand, and he looked at her with a directness that she found, for reasons she could not have named, slightly irritating. "I'm looking for the Ashworth estate," he said. "I was told it was on the north side of town, but I seem to have come around the wrong way." His voice was clear, unhurried, and had the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to being listened to, which struck Clara as odd, given how he looked. She glanced at Louisa, just briefly, and Louisa pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Clara looked the man over once more. Mud-streaked boots, old jacket, no hat, a piece of paper that looked like it might be a delivery note. She drew a small, quiet conclusion and acted on it without examining it even slightly. "The Ashworth estate," she said, with the patient, clear diction one uses when speaking to a child or someone easily confused, "is north of the market square. You'll want to take the lane past the farrier's, that's the blacksmith, the one with the horseshoe above the door, and follow it until you reach the stone wall. The delivery entrance is on the left side. The family does not use the front gate for commercial calls." She watched his face carefully as she said it, looking for the small flicker of embarrassment or the nod of grateful understanding that she expected. She had spoken helpfully, she had been specific, she had even translated the word farrier in case he didn't know it. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she could not read. It was not anger, not gratitude, not confusion. It was simply still, as if he were listening to something other than her words. "I see," he said. "Thank you." That was all. He folded the piece of paper he was holding and put it in his jacket pocket. He looked at her once more, just briefly, but long enough that she had the strange and unwelcome sensation of being the one being studied, and then he walked away in the direction she had pointed, unhurried, with a long, easy stride that seemed to cost him nothing. Delivery, do you think? Louisa said once he was far enough away. Obviously, Clara said, turning back to the cloth. A farmer, or perhaps someone bringing something up from one of the mills. He looked completely lost. He didn't seem lost, Louisa said, in the mild tone she used when she wanted to disagree with something but didn't want to press it. He was asking for directions, Clara said. People ask for directions when they're in an unfamiliar town. It doesn't mean they're lost so much as new. He had mud on his boots up to the ankle, Clara said, and that jacket has been mended at least twice. He's a working man who can't read his own delivery instructions properly. I was simply helpful. Louisa picked up a ribbon from the stall and looked at it. You sent him to the servants' entrance, she said. I sent him to the correct entrance for a commercial call. You told him the family doesn't use the front gate for commercial calls. He hadn't told you he was making a commercial call. There was a small pause. Clara looked at the green wool again. Well, she said finally, I assumed. Louisa said nothing further on the subject, which was in its own way more uncomfortable than if she had continued. They moved on to the next stall, where Mrs. Cooper was selling small pots of gooseberry jam, and the conversation turned to other things, and the man with the muddy boots and the steady eyes slipped from Clara's attention entirely. It was a Tuesday morning like many others. She had been helpful to a stranger in her own way, and that was that. The rest of the morning moved at the unhurried pace of market day in Caldwell. Clara and Louisa bought a small amount of cheese, declined the undersized turnips, and stopped for tea at Mrs. Bell's shop on the corner of the square, which sold tea, seed cake, and local gossip in roughly equal measure. The gossip that morning was pleasantly unimportant, a dispute about a fence between two farms on the valley's edge, a new minister expected in the coming month, and the arrival of a traveling exhibition of photographs from London that was to spend a week in the town hall. Clara found all of this easy and comfortable, the way one finds a familiar chair comfortable, not because it is the finest chair in the world, but because it is the right shape for how you sit. She walked home just before noon, passing the Fenwick house and waving to Louisa at the gate, and arriving at the Ashworth house to find it in its usual state of ordered quiet. The Ashworths were a family that ran a tight household. Not because they were unkind. Clara's father, George Ashworth, was a broadly good-natured man, but because order was what the family understood. There was a time for breakfast and a time for supper. There was a right way to address the cook and a correct angle at which a picture should hang. There was a social level at which the family moved, and it had been established over 2 generations of careful mercantile success, and nobody in the household was allowed to forget it. Clara's mother, Frances Ashworth, had died when Clara was 11 years old, of a fever that arrived one winter and did not leave. In the years since, Clara had grown up under the combined influence of her father's ambitions, her aunt's instruction in manners and household management, and her own considerable mind, which had no formal schooling to channel it, and had therefore turned its energy largely inward, developing opinions, observations, and a certainty about most things that could have, with different nourishment, become something far more generous. She had a younger brother named William, who was 16 and away at school, and an elderly spaniel named Pepper who slept in front of the kitchen fire, and had done so for so many years that the stone beneath him had worn smooth. The house had a cook, a housekeeper, a maid, and a man who came to tend the garden on Wednesdays. It was a household of modest comfort and respectable standing, and Clara had grown up knowing, in the precise and careful way that such households teach their daughters, exactly where the Ashworths stood in the order of Caldwell and what that position required of her. She ate a light lunch alone at the dining table. Her father was at his office in town, and then read for an hour in the sitting room, a novel she had borrowed from Louisa that she was finding only moderately interesting but too expensive to have bought herself, and therefore felt obliged to finish. The afternoon was the quietest part of her day, and she usually welcomed it. At 3:30, the housekeeper, Mrs. Gale, knocked on the sitting room door. "There's a letter for your father, miss, just arrived by messenger. He said it's to be given to Mr. Ashworth when he returns and to no one else. But there's also a card." She held out a small white calling card on the edge of a silver tray, and Clara took it. She read it, then she read it again. The card was plain, cream-colored, and very good quality, the kind of card you noticed immediately because it was neither showy nor cheap, but simply right. It was printed in black ink, clean and small. Edmund Harwell, Harwell Park, North Yorkshire. Nothing else, no title, no honorific, just the name and the house. Clara's hand went still. She knew the name Harwell. Every family in Caldwell and the surrounding area knew it. Harwell Park was one of the oldest estates in the county, not the largest, but among the most respected. The Harwells had held land in Yorkshire for 6 generations. Their name appeared in the county records in ways that the Ashworth name, with its 2 careful generations of merchant prosperity, simply did not. A Harwell had funded the restoration of the church tower on the south side of Caldwell 30 years ago. A Harwell had been a magistrate, a county commissioner, a man whose opinion carried weight in York and beyond. Edmund Harwell was the current lord. She had heard his name in the way one hears the names of people in a higher orbit, as a reference point, not as a real person. She had heard that he was perhaps 30 or near it, that he had been away for a time traveling or managing affairs in London, some said, and that he was unmarried. She looked at the card again. Edmund Harwell had come to Caldwell today. He had sent his card ahead by messenger and a letter for her father. She sat with this for a long moment. Then she set the card down carefully on the side table and looked out the window at the garden, where the September light was doing something particularly golden through the trees. She did not know what the letter said. She would not read it. It was addressed to her father. But she was not naive and she was not slow, and by the time her father's key turned in the front door at 5 o'clock, she had already felt the first small tremor of something she could not quite name in that deep and quiet part of herself where certainty lived. George Ashworth came in from the hall in his overcoat, a man of 52 with a good broad face and grey beginning at his temples, and he found his daughter sitting in the hall as if she had happened to be there by accident, when in fact she had been sitting there for 20 minutes, holding a book she had not read a single word of. He saw her face and he understood, in the way fathers sometimes do, that she already knew something was happening. "You've seen the card," he said. "Mrs. Gale showed it to me," she said. "She was following your instructions. She left the letter alone." He nodded. He still had his coat on. He looked at his daughter for a moment, at her careful posture, and the book held slightly too tightly in her hands, and he made a decision about how much to say. "Edmund Harwell has requested a formal introduction," he said. "He'll call here tomorrow morning at 10. His letter was formal and very proper. He's been told through mutual parties, I won't say more than that, that we have a daughter of age, and he has made his intentions of introduction known in the right way. That's all I know, Clara. The rest is to be seen." She nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "At 10, her father said again. He started toward the stairs, then paused. "He is, by all accounts, a good man, patient, direct, not given to performance." He paused again, as if he were about to say something more and then decided against it. "Get a good night's rest." He went up the stairs. Clara remained in the hall for several minutes longer, the book still in her hands, looking at nothing in particular. The September light had gone from golden to grey, the way it does so suddenly in England at the end of summer, and the house around her was very quiet. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about the name on the card and the letter in her father's hands and the whole unfolding of something she had somehow known, in the vague way one knows a season is about to change, was coming toward her. She did not think about the man at the market, not once, not yet. She went upstairs and dressed for dinner, and sat at the table across from her father's familiar silence, and ate her meal with the careful table manners her aunt had drilled into her from the age of 12, and afterward she sat in the sitting room with the moderately interesting novel and did not read a single page of it. At 9 o'clock she went up to bed and lay in the dark looking at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about what to wear tomorrow, what to say, what kind of woman a Harwell would be looking for, and how to be, for that one morning, exactly the right version of herself. She fell asleep thinking about none of these things, actually, because sleep came for her in the middle of a thought about the strange stillness on the face of a man with mud on his boots and dark, unhurried eyes, and she did not notice it happen. The morning came the way mornings do after a night of shallow sleep, suddenly, with more light than expected, and the immediate sense that the day was already ahead of her. Clara was awake before her maid came to the door. She had in fact been awake since 6:30, lying in her bed and listening to the house come alive around her, the distant sounds from the kitchen below, the creak of Mrs. Gale's door, the scratch of Pepper's claws on the hallway floor as he made his slow, arthritic morning journey toward the stairs. She chose her clothes with more care than usual, not the pale blue coat from yesterday, that was a walking coat, for the market, for ordinary Tuesday mornings that turned out to be ordinary. She chose instead the dress she thought of as her best morning dress, deep ivory with a narrow collar and small, neat buttons at the cuff. It was quiet and correct without being dull, and it suited her, and she knew it suited her, and she knew that knowing it suited her was precisely the sort of confidence she needed this morning. She sat at her dressing table while the maid pinned her hair and looked at herself in the oval mirror with the kind of measuring eye she was used to turning outward on the world. She was not vain exactly. Vanity required a degree of uncertainty, a constant need to be reassured, and Clara rarely needed reassurance. She was simply practical about her appearance the way she was practical about most things. She had dark hair, a clear skin, and eyes that were a particular shade of gray-green that people occasionally paused to notice. She was not the most beautiful woman in Caldwell, she had never claimed to be, but she was composed, and she had learned early that composure, in a room full of pretty women, often outlasts beauty by some margin. By 9:30 she was downstairs, sitting with her father over the last of the breakfast things, both of them mostly quiet in the comfortable way of people who have shared a house for many years. Her father was reading the paper. She was looking at the garden through the window. The clock in the hallway struck 10:15. She straightened slightly. Her father turned a page. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the front door. The man who walked into the Ashworth sitting room at 10 o'clock on that Wednesday morning in September of 1908 was, and Clara understood this before he had taken 3 steps into the room, the same man she had sent to the delivery entrance the day before. The realization did not come loudly. It did not arrive with a crash or a gasp. It came quietly, the way cold air comes through a gap in a window, and it settled over her before she had time to decide what to do with it. She sat very still. Her hands, resting in her lap, did not move. Her face did not change. Years of careful training in the art of appearing composed served her now, though she had never before needed it for quite this reason. He was dressed differently today. That was the first thing her mind noted. In the mechanical way a mind notes facts when it is working very hard on something else. Yesterday he had worn an old jacket with mended elbows and boots caked with dried mud from a long journey across open fields. Today he wore a dark gray wool suit that was not showy but was clearly very good, the kind of suit that does not announce itself, because it does not need to. His boots were clean. His hair had been trimmed, or at least combed with more intention. He was, altogether, a man who looked entirely at home in a well-furnished sitting room, and Clara's mind performed the quick, unpleasant arithmetic of comparing the 2 versions of him and understanding what the answer meant. Her father had risen from his chair to shake the man's hand, and was now doing so with a warmth that Clara had rarely seen him direct at a stranger. "Lord Harwell," her father said, "it is a genuine pleasure to welcome you to our home." Lord Harwell, there it was, not a delivery man, not a farm worker who had walked too far and needed to find the servant's gate, not someone who could not read his own delivery instructions. A lord, the Lord. The one her father had told her about last evening, standing in the hall with his coat still on, using the words patient and direct and not given to performance. Edmund Harwell shook her father's hand with a firm, unhurried grip. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, "thank you for receiving me." His voice was the same voice she had heard at the market. Clear, steady, and with that particular quality of ease that she had noticed yesterday and found, she now realized, not irritating but deeply, simply natural. Then he turned to look at her. She met his eyes. She had no choice. To look away would have been more conspicuous than to hold his gaze, and Clara, whatever else she was, did not flinch from situations. So she looked at him, and he looked at her, and for 2 full seconds, which is a very long time when you are standing inside them, neither of them said a word. His expression was entirely composed. There was nothing in it that she could read as mockery or satisfaction or cruelty or even particular amusement. There was simply, and this was almost worse, a quiet steadiness that seemed to say that he had expected this, or something very like it, and had already decided how he intended to proceed. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and inclined his head slightly, "I'm very glad to meet you." The words were perfectly correct. The tone was entirely measured. And somewhere beneath both of those things was a layer of meaning that only 2 people in that room could feel, and one of them was Clara, and the other was Edmund Harwell, and her father was already gesturing toward the chairs and asking Mrs. Gale, who had appeared in the doorway, to bring tea. Clara stood and offered a small, careful curtsy, the formal one, the one her aunt had made her practice until it looked natural, and said, "Welcome to Caldwell, Lord Harwell," in a voice that she was quietly proud of, given the circumstances. They sat, Her father and Lord Harwell began the opening movements of polite conversation: the weather, the road from York, the state of the harvest season, and Clara sat in her chair with her hands folded and her face pleasant and her mind running at a speed that she hoped was not visible. She was trying to reconstruct the previous morning with the accuracy of a court recorder. She had looked him over. She had noted his mud-streaked boots and his worn jacket and his absence of a hat. She had heard him ask for directions to the Ashworth estate. She had looked at Louisa. She pressed her teeth together briefly. She had spoken to him in the slow, simplified tone one uses for people one has decided are simple. She had told him to use the delivery entrance. She had said, quite clearly, that the family did not use the front gate for commercial calls. The family? She had spoken of her own family as if they were a separate category of people, a category to which he could not possibly belong, and she had done it in front of him, on the street, in a market square where anyone could hear. And he had said, what had he said? Only 2 words, "I see," and then "thank you," and then he had walked away with that long, easy stride. She looked at him now, sitting across from her father, and she watched the way he listened. And he did listen, genuinely, with his whole attention, not the nodding half-attention that people perform while they wait for their own turn to speak. He asked her father a question about the local mills, and her father's face lit up in the way it only did when someone asked him a question he actually wanted to answer, and Clara thought, he knew exactly what he was asking. He chose that question because it was the right one. This is a man who reads people. The tea arrived. Clara poured. It was her role, and she performed it with the practiced ease of someone who has poured tea in company since she was 15, and Edmund Harwell accepted his cup with a quiet thank you that was somehow different from the merely polite version of the same words. It was direct, present, like all of his words. Her father was talking now about the history of the Ashworth business, which he did not often do in company because he was modest about it, but which he seemed willing to do now because Lord Harwell had asked with what appeared to be genuine interest. Clara watched this happening and felt a complicated feeling settle in her chest. She was proud of her father. She was glad he was being given space to speak well. And underneath both of those feelings was the newer, colder awareness that the man sitting across from them had come here today, had taken the time to send a card and a formal letter, and to arrive exactly at 10, after she had sent him to the servants' entrance. Had he known who she was? At the market, when he asked for the Ashworth estate, had he known that the woman he was speaking to was Clara Ashworth herself? She turned this question over carefully. He had asked for the estate by name. He had been coming here to this house. He might have seen her before. She was not unknown in Caldwell, or he might have been told her name or her description, or he might simply have asked a young woman at the cloth stall for directions without knowing anything about her. She could not tell. His face gave her nothing, and his manners gave her nothing, and this was maddening in a way she had not felt before, because Clara Ashworth was accustomed to reading people, and she was discovering that this particular person did not make it easy. "Miss Ashworth," she came back into the room. Edmund Harwell was looking at her. "Your father tells me you're fond of walking. I noticed on my way in that the valley south of town looks particularly fine this time of year." It was a small, easy remark, the kind that asks nothing difficult and opens a conversation gently. But Clara, in her current state of heightened attention, heard something beneath it. He had noticed the valley. He had arrived here by the valley route, which meant he had come from the south, which was not the road from York. He had come into town from a different direction than expected. He had perhaps walked through the town on foot, looking at it before his formal arrival. A man who reads places the same way he reads people. "I am," she said, meeting his eyes with the same steadiness she had held since he came into the room. "I walked to the market yesterday morning as a matter of fact. It is an easy walk, and the square on a Tuesday is always worth seeing." She watched his face. Nothing changed. He nodded just slightly, as if agreeing with a simple observation about the market day. "I should have liked to see it," he said. "I arrived in town late in the morning and missed the main activity." She looked at him, he looked at her. Her father was reaching for a slice of seed cake and remarking to nobody in particular that Mrs. Gale made the best seed cake in the county. Late in the morning, but he had been at the market in the morning. She had spoken to him before noon, she was certain of it. And yet he said he had arrived late and missed the market. Either he was mistaken about the time, or he was choosing, very deliberately, to give her a way out. She felt something shift in her chest, not a dramatic shift, nothing visible but something real. He was not pretending they had not met. He was not pretending the market had not happened. He was simply not using it, not yet. perhaps not ever. He was giving her a clean floor to stand on and leaving it to her to decide what to do with the gift. Clara Ashworth had never in her life been given a gift she did not know how to respond to. But this one, this small, quiet, utterly dignified gesture, left her temporarily without words. She found some. She was good at finding words. "The market is worth an early start," she said. "If you visit Caldwell again, I'd recommend arriving by 9. "I'll remember that," he said, and the conversation moved on. For the next half hour they talked. Her father and Lord Harwell discussed the county, the farms, the coming winter, the state of the roads. Lord Harwell asked Clara twice more for her opinion, once about the traveling exhibition of photographs she had heard about at Mrs. Bell's tea shop, and once about the new footbridge the town council had proposed for the river south of the square. Both times he listened to her answer with the same focused attention he gave her father, which was, she noticed this particularly, neither more nor less careful than what he gave to anybody else in the room. He did not perform interest in her. He simply had it, and showed it the way people show genuine things, which is quietly and without effort. When he stood to leave, 45 minutes after he had arrived, he shook her father's hand again and thanked him for a most pleasant morning. Then he turned to Clara, and for the second time that day, the second time she supposed in 2 meetings, he looked at her with that same still, reading expression that she could not quite penetrate. "Thank you for the tea," he said. "It was a pleasure," she said. He held her gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than was strictly necessary, and then he put on his hat, a very good one, she noticed now, the kind that cost significantly more than the jacket he had worn at the market, and he walked to the front door where the maid was waiting with his coat. He went out, the door closed. Her father turned to her with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and failing. "Well," her father said. "Well," said Clara. There was a long pause. "I think," her father said carefully, "that went rather well." Clara looked at the door that Edmund Harwell had just walked out of. She thought about the market, and the servant's entrance, and the clean floor he had given her to stand on without once asking her to thank him for it. "Yes," she said. "I think it did." She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, not reading, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting with the particular quality of silence that comes after something has changed, and you are not yet sure what to do about it, but you know quite certainly that it has. She thought about Louisa. She would have to see Louisa sooner or later, today probably or tomorrow, and Louisa would want to know how the morning had gone, and Clara would have to find a way to describe Edmund Harwell without saying the thing she knew and could not say, that she had already met him on the street, and had been less than kind, and that he had come to her house anyway and given her a morning that she had not deserved. She would not tell Louisa about the market. Not yet. She was not even sure she would tell her at all. It was not a secret exactly. There had been nothing shameful in the words themselves, nothing that anyone watching would have identified as deeply wrong. A young woman had sent a plainly dressed stranger to the delivery entrance. People did that. It happened. Society in 1908 was built on the assumption that certain doors were for certain people, and that directing someone to the correct door was simply good order. Except she knew that was not what it had been. She had not been maintaining good order. She had been performing her own superiority for an audience of one, who happened to be her friend Louisa, while speaking to a man she had decided, before he had said more than 10 words, was beneath her notice. She had decided it from the mud on his boots and the wear on his elbows, and she had been quite satisfied with that decision, and she had acted on it without a moment's hesitation. And he had said "I see" and "thank you" and walked away and come to her house the next morning and been, in every particular, the kind of man she had spent her whole life expecting to meet. She lay back on her bed and looked at the ceiling. Outside her window, the September afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going golden again in the same way it had yesterday, when she had sat in the hall waiting for her father and thinking about what to wear. What had she thought about on that first evening? She had thought about the right version of herself, about how to be for one morning exactly what she needed to be. She had planned it the way you plan a performance, the dress, the posture, the questions to ask that show you have listened, the observations that reveal intelligence without seeming to try. And this morning, none of that planning had mattered. She had sat across from Edmund Harwell, and he had looked at her, and she had forgotten all of her careful preparation and simply been herself, rattled, uncertain, doing her best to hold a composed face over a mind that was running in all directions at once. and he had somehow seemed more interested in that version than in any version she could have planned. She did not understand this. She was not certain she needed to, but she lay on her bed in the golden afternoon light and felt, beneath all the discomfort and the self-examination and the complicated arithmetic of the past 2 days, something that surprised her by its warmth, something that felt cautiously like the beginning of wanting to be a better version of herself, not for a single morning, but in general. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not the kind of feeling she was used to, but it was there, quiet and persistent, like a small fire in a cold room, and she did not try to put it out. Downstairs, she heard her father moving about in his study. Outside, the garden was still in the late afternoon. The clock in the hallway began to count off 5 o'clock, and Clara Ashworth, lying on her bed with her best morning dress still on and her hair still pinned, stared at the ceiling and understood that something in her life had quietly, irrevocably turned a corner, and that she had not been the one steering. Dinner that evening was quieter than usual. Her father ate with the satisfied air of a man who had accomplished something without quite finishing it, and Clara ate with the air of a woman who was thinking about something else and managing, just barely not to let it show. They talked about William's last letter from school, and the fence dispute that was apparently still not resolved between the farms in the valley, and whether they ought to order the winter coal earlier this year given that last January had been particularly severe. They did not talk about Edmund Harwell, not directly, but he sat at the table with them as clearly as if he had been in the third chair, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, because some things in a family are understood without words. She went to bed that night not with plans but with questions, and she slept better than she expected. 3 days passed without word from Harwell Park. Clara did not count the days, or rather she counted them without intending to, the way you count the beats of silence after a door closes. Wednesday had been the visit. Thursday she had walked with Louisa and said nothing important. Friday her father had gone to York on business and come home in the evening with a bottle of good wine and the expression of a man who had heard something agreeable, though he did not say what. Saturday was the 6th day of September, and the morning was clear, and the valley south of town was, just as Edmund Harwell had noted, very fine. She found herself thinking about him in the way she thought about problems, that is, persistently and from different angles, each time she turned away thinking she was done and each time finding another surface she had not yet examined. She thought about his voice, the way he spoke without raising or lowering it to impress or appease, the way he had asked her father about the mills and made the older man's whole bearing change. She thought about the 2 seconds of eye contact in the sitting room and what it had contained, which she still could not fully name. She thought about Louisa's voice at the market. He didn't seem lost. Louisa had seen it, or felt it, immediately. She had noticed something in 30 seconds of looking at a stranger that Clara had entirely missed. And the difference was simple. Louisa had looked at the man and Clara had looked at the jacket. Clara had done what she always did, which was assess a situation quickly and act on the assessment before examining whether the assessment was accurate. She was decisive. She had always understood this about herself and had always understood it as a strength. She was beginning to examine whether that was true. On Saturday afternoon, while the light was still good, she took herself for a walk, alone this time without Louisa, along the lane that ran south of the market square and then curved up toward the ridge where you could see the whole valley spread out below. It was a walk she had taken many times, usually with company, and never particularly for thinking. Today she took it for thinking. The valley was, as advertised, very fine. The fields were that particular shade of late summer gold that only lasts for a week or two in September before the harvesting cuts them down, and the hedgerows on either side of the lane were heavy and full with blackthorn and dog rose, and the sky above was pale blue going white at the edges with high cloud. She walked for 20 minutes up the lane before she reached the stile at the top of the ridge and sat on it and looked out. From up here the town was a compact arrangement of rooftops and a single church spire, all of it held in the valley like something cupped in 2 hands. She had always loved this view. It made the town look manageable, like a thing you could understand entirely. From up here, everything in Caldwell looked proportionate and small and orderly. She had, she thought, been living in this view for her whole life. That is to say, she had been up above everything, looking down and finding the arrangement orderly and feeling good about her position in it. And it had not once occurred to her to wonder how things looked from the ground. She sat on the stile for a long time. A crow landed on the fence post 6 feet away and regarded her with the particular intelligence of crows and then flew off again. The wind came across the ridge from the east, carrying the smell of turned earth from a field somewhere beyond the valley, and Clara Ashworth, who was not generally given to moments of quiet revelation, felt something settle in her like earth after rain, heavier than before but more solid. She had been, she thought plainly, a person of significant limitations. Not in the ways the world counted. She was educated, well-mannered, capable of conversation on a wide range of subjects, able to manage a household and write a clear letter and hold her own in any social situation Caldwell had ever offered her. Those were real qualities. She was not being falsely modest. But they were the surfaces of a life, not its substance, and she had allowed herself to mistake the surface for the thing beneath it. Edmund Harwell had walked into the market square in mud-caked boots and a worn jacket, and she had not seen a person. She had seen a category, and the category she had placed him in was one that told her, without any further thought required, exactly how to treat him, which was, efficiently at arm's length with the brisk helpfulness one shows to people who are passing through. She had shown him to the servant's entrance of her own life, and turned back to the cloth stall. She climbed down from the stile and walked back toward town. The golden light was doing something particularly lovely to the rooftops below her, but she did not stop to look at it this time. She was moving with the slightly purposeful air of someone who has worked something out and is now ready to stop working it out and start doing something with the result, even if she did not yet know what that something was. Back in town, she turned down the lane past the farriers, the same lane she had directed Edmund Harwell down 2 days ago, pointing to the delivery entrance, and came out at the north side of the market square. The market was long over. The stalls were gone. The square was empty except for an elderly woman crossing it slowly with a basket, and 2 boys chasing a dog that did not particularly want to be caught. She stood in the exact spot where she had been standing when he had come up behind her. She played it back carefully, his voice, his face, the folded piece of paper, his calm when she spoke, the way he had looked at her with that unreadable quality, not blank, not cold, but still, like a pool of deep water that shows you only the surface until you look more carefully. "I see," he had said, "thank you." She had given him precisely nothing to thank her for, except the information required to find the servant's gate. And he had thanked her anyway, without edge, without irony, without any of the small weapons that a person of lesser self-possession would have reached for. What kind of man does that? She thought about it as she walked home. What kind of man absorbs a small unkindness without reflecting it back, and then goes to the woman's house the next morning and sits across from her, and gives her 45 minutes of genuine attention, and never once uses what he knows? 2 kinds, she thought, the kind who has not noticed, or the kind who has noticed and chosen. Edmund Harwell had not failed to notice, she was certain of that. He read people too carefully, listened too well, moved through a room with too much quiet awareness. He had noticed everything about her, the tone of her voice, the set of her face, the language she had used. He had carried all of it home with him, and he had sat with it overnight, and he had come to her house anyway and chosen to begin again. That was not weakness, that was not passivity. She had enough sense to understand that now, even if it had taken her 3 days, and a walk to a ridge, and a crow regarding her from a fence post to get there. She arrived home to find her father already at his desk in the study, writing a letter. He looked up when she came in, still in her coat and hat. "Good walk," he said. "Yes," she said, "I went up to the ridge." Her father nodded. He looked at her for a moment with the quiet attention he rarely showed, and that she had not, until recently, noticed as particularly similar to anything. "You look like you've been thinking," he said. "I have," she said. "Good," said her father, and turned back to his letter. She went upstairs and changed her coat for a cardigan, and sat at her writing desk by the window. She had a small pile of correspondence that had been waiting for a week, a letter to William, a note to thank Mrs. Patterson for the invitation to her garden party in October, and she opened them now and began to answer them. She wrote to William first, as she usually did. He was 16 and at a school outside Leeds, and wrote home once a month in a hand that was gradually improving, and with content that was largely about cricket and slightly about mathematics, and occasionally, when he was feeling expansive, about books. She wrote him a longer letter than usual. She told him about the traveling exhibition of photographs coming to the town hall, and about the crow on the fence post, and about the view from the ridge. She did not tell him about Edmund Harwell. That was not a subject for a letter to a 16-year-old brother, not yet, but she wrote warmly, and the letter, when she folded it, was fuller than her letters to William usually were. Then she sat for a while and looked out the window without writing anything. On Sunday morning at church, she saw 3 people she knew well enough to stop and speak to, and she was conscious for the first time of how she spoke to them, conscious not in the performing way but in the honest way. She heard herself as if from a small distance. She was cordial as she always was. She was pleasant, but she noticed where she was also slightly efficient, slightly surface level, slightly careful not to give too much. She noticed where she performed interest rather than feeling it. It was an uncomfortable thing to notice. She was not sure she could have seen it a week ago. After church, walking home through the mild Sunday morning, she passed the spot at the north end of the market square where Edmund Harwell had said, "I was looking for the Ashworth estate." She walked past it without stopping, but she felt it as she passed it, the way you feel a room you have walked through before when something in it has changed. That afternoon a messenger came to the house, not a letter, a card. The same cream-colored, simply printed card as before, with a note written on the back in a clear, unhurried hand. "Miss Ashworth, I would very much welcome the opportunity to call again, with your father's permission and your own, at a time convenient to your household. I am in Caldwell until Friday. E.H." Clara read it twice. Then she went to her father's study and knocked on the door and went in and put the card on his desk and waited. Her father read it, then he looked up at her. "What would you like to do?" he said. Clara had thought on the ridge about what kind of woman she intended to be. She had not finished thinking about it. It was not the sort of thinking you finish in a single afternoon, but she had thought enough to have a direction. "I would like to see him again," she said. Her father looked at her for a moment longer, with that quiet, reading expression that she was now beginning to recognize as something she had perhaps always inherited. "I'll write back this evening," he said. She nodded and left the study and went to the kitchen to see if there was any seed cake left, because she found she was suddenly and inexplicably hungry, and Mrs. Gale's seed cake was, as her father had said, the best in the county. There was cake. She ate 2 slices. She told Mrs. Gale that the cake was very good. She meant it and she said so, and Mrs. Gale looked briefly surprised and then very pleased, and Clara noticed both of those things and felt, for the first time in a long while, as though she were standing on something real. The next morning was Monday, and it brought with it that particular Monday quality of resuming, the ordinary machinery of a week clicking back into motion. The market closed, the church quiet, the town at its working pace. Clara woke early again, not from anxiety this time but from something that felt more like readiness, which was different in the same way that standing up differs from being pushed. She went to see Louisa. Louisa lived in the Fenwick house 3 doors down, a roomy old place with a wisteria on the front wall that had been there so long it was now more structural than decorative. Louisa's mother was a pleasant, distracted woman who collected small china objects and was always in the middle of an improving novel she never quite finished. Louisa herself was in the garden when Clara arrived, cutting back the rose bushes with the particular expression of someone who has been asked to do a garden task they do not especially enjoy, but have decided to approach philosophically. "Come and help me," Louisa said immediately. "I've been at this for 20 minutes and the roses are winning." Clara took the other pair of gloves from the garden wall and began cutting. They worked side by side for a few minutes without speaking, which was one of the things Clara had always valued about Louisa, the companionship of silence. "He came back," Clara said eventually. "Lord Harwell, he visited on Wednesday morning. And he sent a card asking to call again." Louisa snipped a long stem with a precise click and placed it in the basket at her feet. "And," she said. "And I want to see him again," Clara said. Louisa looked at her sideways. "Good," she said, with the same plain directness that she had used at the market, and said nothing further because Louisa understood better than most that some things do not need commentary. They cut roses for another half-hour and then went inside for tea, and Louisa's mother came in and talked for 15 minutes about her current improving novel, which appeared to be about a woman who traveled to Italy and had a series of instructive experiences, and then drifted back out again, and then it was just the 2 of them again at the kitchen table with their tea. "He was at the market," Clara said. "On Tuesday morning, the man with the muddy boots, that was Edmund Harwell." Louisa set down her cup. She looked at Clara with an expression that contained several things at once, but the dominant one was not surprise. "I thought so," she said quietly. "You thought so?" Clara repeated. "When?" "When you told me he was coming to call, I thought, that man at the market, but I wasn't certain so I didn't say." Clara looked at her. Why didn't you say on Tuesday at the market? You said he didn't seem lost. What did you see that I didn't? Louisa thought about this genuinely, the way she thought about things slowly and honestly, without rushing to a clever answer. He stood still, she said finally, when you spoke to him. Most people, when they're being directed somewhere, lean slightly in the direction you're pointing. He didn't move, he just listened. And his face, she paused. His face looked like he was deciding something. Clara absorbed this. He was deciding something, standing there at the cloth stall with his worn jacket and his folded piece of paper, looking at her, deciding. He had decided to come anyway. He had decided to give her the clean floor. She drank her tea and thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who decides to keep looking after what they've seen. He's coming again on Thursday, she said. Louisa picked up her cup. Good, she said for the second time with the same plain warmth as the first. Wear the ivory dress again. Clara laughed. It was the first full, real laugh she had managed in nearly a week, and it felt like something unclenching. She walked home through the mild Monday morning, through streets that looked the same as they always had but that she was looking at differently. She passed the grocer, and she did not notice whether the good apples were at the front. She passed Mrs. Holt in the coat that had been dyed to look newer than it was, and she smiled and said good morning and meant both of those things, and Mrs. Holt looked slightly startled and then smiled back with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. She passed the spot on the lane where she had pointed Edmund Harwell toward the delivery entrance. She stopped there for a moment deliberately and looked at the lane and then at the front gate of the Ashworth house, which was 30 feet further on. 2 entrances, one for people and one for everyone else. She had lived here her entire life and never once thought to question the arrangement. She went home, she went up to her room. She took out a piece of paper and a pen, and she sat at her writing desk and looked at the blank page for a long time. She was going to write something, she was not sure what exactly. Not the letter she would eventually write to Edmund, which was still weeks away. Not a letter to anyone. More like words for herself, words to mark the place, the way you press a flower into a book to hold the page. She wrote, I have been looking at things from a long way up, and thinking that was the same as seeing clearly. Then she put the pen down and folded the paper and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, and sat for a while in the Monday quiet and thought about Thursday, and felt, in spite of everything, in spite of the discomfort and the self-examination and the complicated weight of the last several days, something that was close to hope. Thursday came with rain, not the dramatic, heavy rain that announces itself with thunder and makes people feel they have lived through something, but the quiet, persistent Yorkshire rain that simply arrives and stays, turning the stone pavements dark and filling the gutters, and making the whole valley smell of wet earth and old wood. Clara stood at the sitting-room window at 9:30 and watched it fall on the garden, and thought, of course. She was wearing the ivory dress as Louisa had suggested. She had put her hair up more carefully than usual, with a small amber pin that had been her mother's, and she had looked at herself in the mirror for a long time before coming downstairs, not with the measuring eye she usually turned on her own reflection, but with something more honest. She was nervous. She was acknowledging that to herself, which was also new. She had always preferred to feel confident and then act, but confidence this morning felt like a thing she had to earn, and she was not yet sure she had. The rain made the house quieter. It made the sitting room feel contained and close, which could be either comforting or unbearable depending on who was in it. Clara moved from the window to the bookshelf and back to the window, and then sat down in her usual chair and picked up a book and set it down again. Her father came in from the hall with his good coat on, and the look of a man who is trying to be unobtrusive in a domestic situation he does not entirely understand. I thought I'd be in the study, he said, give you both a chance to talk without me hovering. You don't hover, Clara said. I do sometimes, he said pleasantly. I'll be near enough if I'm needed. Mrs. Gale will serve tea. He went out. Clara looked at the fire, which was lit for the first time this season. September had turned cold overnight, and thought about Edmund Harwell walking up the lane in the rain, and whether he had an umbrella or whether he was the sort of person who simply walked in rain as though it were ordinary air. He arrived at exactly 10 o'clock again. She noted this. The punctuality was not the nervous, overcompensating kind, but the comfortable kind, the kind that says I said 10 and I mean 10 because I respect your time. The maid showed him in. He came through the sitting room door in a dark coat with raindrops on the shoulders, and he was carrying, she noticed this, no umbrella. He had simply walked in the rain. He looked at her and she looked at him, and this time the silence between them was 2 seconds again, but the quality of it was different from Wednesday. Wednesday's silence had been full of recognition and the complex charged weight of what they both knew. This silence was, she searched for the word, expectant, like the pause before music begins. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I hope the walk wasn't too unpleasant." "Not at all," he said. "I like rain, it makes everything more specific." She had not heard that thought before. She turned it over as she gestured toward the chair across from her. His chair, she was already thinking of it as, which surprised her, and he sat and removed his coat, which the maid took away, and there he was again. Calm, direct, taking up exactly the space he needed and not an inch more. "More specific," she said. "The details," he said. "When it rains, people pay attention differently. You notice the overhang you've never looked at before, the particular sound a lane makes when water runs along it, things that are invisible when the weather is comfortable." She thought about the valley from the ridge, about the crow on the fence post, about specific things she had not noticed until she stood still long enough to let them become specific. "I think that's true," she said, and meant it without qualification. He looked at her for a moment as if something in her answer had confirmed something for him, though he did not say what. Then Mrs. Gale came in with the tea tray, and the business of pouring began, and the conversation opened out the way it had on Wednesday, but differently, less formal somehow, even with her father absent. Less like a visiting arrangement, and more like two people who have already decided they are interested in each other, and are now going further in. He asked her about the exhibition of photographs. She told him what she knew, that it was coming from London, that it was apparently a collection of images from around the world, places none of them were likely to visit. He said he had been to some of those places, and she looked at him with what she hoped was a composed expression, and asked which ones. He said the north of India, which he had traveled through twice in his late 20s on business connected to a cousin who ran a trading enterprise there. He said the coast of Portugal, which he had visited once with his father before his father died, and which had stayed with him more vividly than almost anything else in his memory. He said parts of Scotland that most people never go to, up beyond Inverness where the land goes flat and pale, and the light in summer never fully disappears. She listened to all of this with genuine attention, not performed attention, not the polite nod and wait of social listening, but the real kind, where you find yourself slightly ahead of the speaker, wondering what comes next. "You've been everywhere," she said. "I've been to some places," he said, with a straightforward modesty that was nothing like false. "There are still a great many I haven't seen. I'd like to see them while I still have the energy to walk about in them." "What was Portugal like?" she said. He thought about this before answering. She had noticed this about him already, the pause before he spoke, the quality of consideration. He did not fill silence with the first available words. "Warm in a way England never quite manages," he said, "and very old. Not old in the way Yorkshire is old, the hedgerows, the lanes, the slow accumulation of generations. Old in a way that makes you feel the centuries like weight, the tiles on the buildings, the light on the water. My father sat on a wall above the harbor for an afternoon and barely spoke. He was not a man who often ran out of things to say." She thought about her own father and his study and the comfortable silence of their Tuesday evenings. She thought about what it would mean to run out of things to say to someone and feel that as a gift rather than a failure. "Did you speak much with your father," she said, "before he died?" It was a more direct question than she usually asked strangers, and she felt the slight edge of it as she said it, but she did not withdraw it. He had given her a real story. It seemed right to respond with a real question. "Yes and no," he said, without appearing to find the question intrusive. "We spoke about everything except the things that mattered most, which I think is fairly common for fathers and sons. After he died, I spent a long time wishing I had asked him certain things. I've tried since then to ask questions when I have the chance. It seemed the better habit." She looked at him, he looked back at her. The fire shifted and settled. "I lost my mother when I was 11, she said. It was not something she said often or easily. She was not sure why she said it now, except that the conversation had reached a depth where it seemed dishonest to stay at the surface. "I know," he said quietly. "I was told before I came to Caldwell. I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago," she said, which was true, and then because it was not entirely true, it still matters. "Of course it does," he said without pause, without the small social hesitation that usually surrounds the subject. Just, of course it does. Simply, immediately, as if it were obvious. She found that she needed a moment after that, and she reached for her tea and drank some, and he waited without filling the space, and she was grateful for the patience. They talked for 2 hours. She had not intended for it to go so long. She had expected the same 45 minutes as Wednesday, but the conversation moved through topics without effort, each one leading naturally to the next. Portugal to fathers to lost to the countryside to books they had both read. He had read widely and was not apologetic about it, to the town of Caldwell, its history, what it had been before the mills came and where it might go in the coming decades. He had opinions. They were not reckless opinions, formed quickly to impress, but considered ones, built from observation and reading and a genuine interest in how things worked. And he wanted to know hers. Not as a courtesy, she had learned to read the difference. He genuinely wanted to know what she thought about things, and when she told him, he listened without planning his response while she spoke, and when he disagreed, and he did, twice, gently and directly, he said why, and gave her space to say why she thought otherwise, and seemed to find her reasons interesting regardless of whether they changed his view. She had never had a conversation quite like it. That was the truth she arrived at around the 90-minute mark, when the rain had stopped outside and the pale gray light of a September midday was coming through the sitting-room windows, and Mrs. Gale had brought a second pot of tea without being asked. She had never had a conversation with anyone, friend, relative, any person she had met in 23 years of social life in Caldwell, that felt quite like this. Like being taken seriously, entirely and without condition. When he stood to leave, she stood too, and they faced each other across the small geography of the sitting room, and she found that she was not performing composure anymore but feeling something quieter and steadier beneath it. "Thank you for calling again," she said. "Thank you for agreeing to it," he said. He paused, and the pause had the quality of something considered. "I wonder," he said, "whether you might like to walk sometime, the valley path south of town perhaps if the weather improves. I had thought about suggesting it on Wednesday, but it seemed too soon." She looked at him. A walk meant away from the sitting room, away from the formal furniture and the tea tray and the maid at the door. A walk meant the two of them in the open air, which was different, more ordinary and more honest both at once. "I'd like that," she said. "Saturday then," he said, "if the weather is decent." "Saturday," she said. He put on his coat. The maid brought his hat. He walked to the front door, as he had on Wednesday, with perfect ease, as though there had never been any other door, and went out into the pale midday that had followed the rain. Clara stood in the sitting room for a moment after the door closed. The fire was low. The second pot of tea was mostly empty. Outside, the lane was wet and bright with puddles, and she could hear from her father's study at the back of the house the sound of a page turning. She went to the kitchen and told Mrs. Gale that the second pot of tea had been very welcome, and Mrs. Gale said she had thought it might be, with the morning being as cold as it was, and Clara thanked her in the specific, present way she was practicing, and went upstairs to change out of the ivory dress before she ruined it in the afternoon, and thought about a walk on Saturday in the valley south of town, and felt the morning settle around her like something she would remember for the rest of her life. Saturday arrived with the kind of morning that September produces occasionally, as if to apologize for all its rain, clear-aired and cool, with a sky so blue it looked almost implausible, and a light that made everything in the valley glow faintly as though it were lit from within. Clara woke early, saw the light through the gap in her curtains, and felt something loosen in her chest. She dressed sensibly for a walk, her brown wool skirt, a warm jacket, and her good walking boots, which were dark brown and well-made and had been a concession she had argued for with her aunt 2 years ago on the grounds that good boots paid for themselves in comfort. She wore her hair simply, with less ceremony than on the days Edmund had come to the house, and when she looked in the mirror she thought, "This is actually what I look like." Edmund arrived at the front gate at 9 o'clock on the dot, and they set off together down the lane toward the south side of town. It was the first time she had walked beside him, and she noticed immediately how his pace was naturally matched to hers, not adjusted, not shortened or lengthened, just easy, as if they had been walking together for years. They went past the farrier's shop and turned south onto the footpath that ran beside the river before climbing toward the ridge. The grass on either side was still wet with the night's dew, and the hedge was full of red-winged birds that had come in from Scandinavia early this year, bright-flanked and busy, pulling berries from the thorn bushes with quick, purposeful movements. She told him about the ridge, about how she had gone there alone the previous weekend and sat on the stile and thought about what it meant to see things from a long way up. She told him more than she had planned to, and less than she felt, which seemed like the right proportion. He listened, walking beside her, not looking at her directly, but glancing sideways from time to time, in the way you do when you are hearing something you are genuinely taking in. "And what did you decide," he said, "about seeing from a long way up?" "That it's comfortable," she said, "and not the same as honest." He made a small sound of agreement, not a word, just a breath that meant, "I know that feeling." "I've done it too," he said, "different version. When I was younger, after my father died, I spent a long time looking at my own circumstances from a great height. Very noble view from up there, all very well ordered. It took me years to come down and look at things the size they actually were." "What made you come down?" she said. "A mistake I made," he said, "that I couldn't blame on the view or the altitude, just on myself and what I'd failed to see." He did not elaborate, and she did not press him. Some things are offered and not extended, and you respect the boundary. They climbed to the ridge and stood at her stile, the one she had sat on last Saturday with the crow, and looked out over the valley together. The town was exactly as it always was from this vantage point: rooftops, church spire, the square, the 4 lanes fanning outward, all manageable, all proportionate, all small. "It is a good view," he said. "Yes," she said. "I've always loved it." "But you looked at it differently last week." "Yes," she said again, "I did." They stood there together in the Saturday morning light, and the valley was quiet below them, and neither of them spoke for a minute or two, and the silence was the most comfortable thing Clara had felt in weeks. On the walk back down, they talked more easily than they had in the sitting room, with the particular looseness that comes from moving through open air together, from looking at the same things at the same time, and having the conversation arrive naturally from what you're both seeing. She showed him where the river ran shallowest in summer, a flat, pebbly stretch where the children of the town came to wade in July. He told her about a river in northern India, where he had watched 2 men fish from opposite banks of a wide, fast current, each of them motionless for 20 minutes at a time in the kind of patience that is not waiting but simply being. "I was not that patient then," he said. "I'm better at it now." She thought about what he had said earlier, about the mistake he had made, about coming down from the altitude of his own comfortable view. She thought about a man who had learned patience and directness, and the ability to look at people rather than at the layer above them, and she wondered how much of what he was had been earned through difficulty, and how much had simply always been there. She thought she might ask him someday, not today, not yet. They came back into town along the north side of the square and passed the cloth stall where she had been standing on Tuesday morning. It was not a market day. The stall was gone, the space empty, but the spot was there, the same pavement, the same angle of the lane. Neither of them said anything about it. They walked past it, side by side, at the same easy pace. He left her at the Ashworth gate at 10:30, and they shook hands in the English way, proper, brief, with the slight warmth of something not quite said, and he told her that he was returning to Harwell Park on Monday, but that he hoped, with her father's agreement and her own, to write. "I'd like that," she said. "I'll write well," he said, with a small dry ease that made her laugh. He walked away up the lane, and she stood at the gate for a moment watching him go, and then went inside and told no one anything about the morning at all, because some things are complete in themselves and don't need to be translated. She went up to her room and stood at the window and looked at the lane where he had walked away, and then looked at the piece of paper in her writing desk drawer. "I have been looking at things from a long way up, and thinking that was the same as seeing clearly, and took it out and read it, and then put it back." She was going to be all right, not in the uncomplicated way she had always assumed she would be all right, not from the comfortable altitude of her own unexamined certainties, but in a harder, more real way. The kind of all right you earn by standing at the correct height and looking at things the size they actually are. It was, she thought, a better kind, and she was glad she had found it, even if the path to it had begun with mud-caked boots and a cloth stall, and a man she had directed to the wrong door on a Tuesday morning in September. Especially because of that. Edmund Harwell's first letter arrived on the following Wednesday. Not Monday, not Tuesday, Wednesday, which meant he had let 2 days pass after returning to Harwell Park before he wrote, and then the letter had taken a day to travel, and the whole arrangement suggested a man who did not rush himself, even when he was interested in something. Clara had checked the post on Monday and Tuesday with the careful indifference of someone who is absolutely not checking the post, And when the letter arrived on Wednesday, she picked it up from the hall table with a steadiness she was quite proud of, and carried it upstairs before opening it. The letter was 2 pages, written in the same clear, unhurried hand that had sent the card. It did not open with any of the usual formalities. "Dear Miss Ashworth, I trust this letter finds you well," but moved directly into a sentence that was characteristic of everything she had learned about him. "I find I have been thinking about the view from the ridge and the particular quality of light you described, and I wanted to tell you that I went looking for a similar view on my way home and found one, though it was not quite the same." She read the whole letter twice. It was a letter about things, about the road from Caldwell to York, and a particular farmhouse he had passed with an unusual chimney that had made him stop to look at it, and a thought he had had about patience and rivers that connected to what they had discussed on Saturday, and one passage about his father standing on the wall in Portugal that he had not quite finished telling her on Thursday and wanted to complete. It was not a romantic letter in the performing sense. It was simply the continuation of a conversation, committed to paper, from someone who had clearly thought about what he wanted to say. At the end he wrote, "I hope you will write back if you feel inclined. I will understand if you do not, but I think you might." She sat at her writing desk for an hour before she began her reply, not from uncertainty about whether to write. That question had been answered before she finished his first page, but from the particular challenge of responding in kind. She had written many letters in her life, letters to friends, to her brother, to relatives, to social acquaintances of various degrees. She knew how to write a correct letter. She even knew how to write an interesting one. She had a clear mind and a good vocabulary, and the discipline of someone who had been made to write everything twice from the age of 9. But this letter required something more specific. It required her to be present in it rather than performed. And that was harder than any of the other kinds, because the performed version of herself was the one she had spent 23 years perfecting, and it had served her very well, and she was now, carefully and with some effort, trying to stop trusting it so completely. She wrote about the sitting room window, and the way the morning light came through it differently in September than in summer, a small observation, offered plainly. She wrote about Pepper the Spaniel, who had discovered a position beside the newly lit fire that he seemed to consider his great accomplishment of the season, and whom she had found this morning looking at her with the expression of a creature who has finally arranged his life satisfactorily. She wrote about the thing he had said, that rain makes things more specific, and told him that she had been testing this theory on the walks she took in the mornings, and found it to be consistently true, and had begun to wonder whether all weather made things specific, and she had simply been giving rain the credit because it was the most persistent of the conditions. At the end, after some thought, she wrote, "You said you would write well, and you have. I'll try to do the same." She sent it on Thursday morning. His reply came the following Monday. This went on for 6 weeks. They wrote to each other twice a week in general, sometimes 3 times when a week was eventful. They were not short letters and they were not shallow ones. She found, to her surprise, that she had more to say than she had expected, not from her life, which was the ordinary life of a well-bred young woman in a Yorkshire market town in the autumn of 1908, but from her mind, which had evidently been accumulating observations and questions and thoughts for years, and had simply been waiting for a correspondent who wanted to receive them. He told her about Harwell Park, which he described with the matter-of-fact affection of someone who loves a thing without needing to romanticize it. It was an old house, he said, older than it looked, with parts that dated back to the early 17th century hidden behind later additions, like history trying to stay warm under newer clothes. He managed the estate himself with a small staff, and had done so since his father's death 9 years ago. He had a particular interest in the farming of the land, not as a hobby or an affectation, but as a genuine responsibility, and he wrote about the decisions involved with a seriousness that she found she admired. She told him about Caldwell, about Mrs. Bell's tea shop and the gossip it generated, about the traveling exhibition of photographs which she had finally seen at the town hall and which had affected her more than she expected, not because the places shown were exotic, but because the people in them were so recognizably human, doing recognizably human things, in landscapes utterly unlike anything she had grown up looking at. She told him about William's latest letter from school, in which he had described with great enthusiasm a cricket match that had apparently lasted 3 days, and which William described as the single greatest event of his year. She told him about the ridge and the crow and the way the valley looked in October, when the trees began to turn and the whole hillside went gold and red, and how it made the view from the stile look like something from a painting, but more so. She told him carefully about what she was learning about herself. She did not do this all at once or in large statements. She did it in small observations, dropped into longer letters like seeds into prepared ground, a sentence about noticing how she spoke to Mrs. Gale, a paragraph about a conversation with Louisa in which she had said something she immediately knew was the surface answer rather than the true one. He read these offerings and responded to them directly and without theater, which was exactly what she needed. October became November. The valley went from gold to brown to the bare, stripped look of late autumn, when the trees are all bones and the sky comes through them in long, horizontal shafts of pale light. Clara wore her heavy coat on her morning walks and came back with red cheeks and cold fingers and the specific satisfaction of someone who has been genuinely cold and is now genuinely warm. The fire in the sitting room was always lit now. Pepper had refined his position in front of it to an art form. In the third week of November, Edmund wrote that he intended to come to Caldwell before Christmas and asked whether the Ashworths would be at home. Her father wrote back before Clara could, which she found both amusing and appropriate. Proper form had been followed since the beginning, and her father was not going to stop following it now, regardless of the fact that his daughter had been corresponding with Lord Harwell 3 times a week for 6 weeks, and had developed, even by her own admission, a complicated and serious set of feelings about the whole arrangement. Edmund came to Caldwell on the 1st of December. It was a cold, clear day, the first of the real cold that announced winter rather than merely suggested it. The ground was frozen. The lane outside the Ashworth house was hard and dry, and the puddles from the previous week's rain had gone solid in the night. And when Clara walked to the gate to look up the lane at 9:55, she could see her own breath in front of her, small white clouds that vanished almost immediately. He came up the lane on foot, as he always did, wearing a good dark overcoat and a scarf she had not seen before, dark wool, the kind that says warmth rather than fashion. He saw her at the gate and his whole expression shifted, not dramatically, nothing so simple as a smile breaking out, but a change of quality, a settling into ease, the way a room changes when a fire is properly lit. "You're standing at the front gate," he said, arriving at it. "I am," she said. "In December." "It's not raining," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had learned to read over the months, not fully transparent but no longer closed to her. He opened the gate. She stepped back to let him through, and they walked up the path to the front door together, side by side, and the cold morning air smelled of frost and distant wood smoke, and the very beginning of something she did not yet have a word for but was no longer trying to outrun. Her father met them in the hall, warm and formal in equal measure, and steered them toward the sitting room and the fire, and the tea that Mrs. Gale had prepared with a slightly elevated quality of biscuits, that suggested even Mrs. Gale understood this was not an ordinary Thursday. They sat in the sitting room and the fire was good and the biscuits were excellent, and Edmund and her father talked about the farms and the winter outlook and the county council and the new road being proposed between Caldwell and York, and then her father found a reason to be in his study for an hour, a document he needed to attend to most urgently, and left them alone. This was not unprecedented. He had done it on the last Thursday visit briefly, but this was longer, and the door closed with the deliberateness of a man making a statement. Clara looked at the fire, Edmund looked at the fire, the clock ticked. "I've been thinking," Edmund said, "about something I want to say to you, and I've been rehearsing it in my head since about mid-October, and I've decided it's better said plainly than rehearsed." She looked at him. "I would like to ask your father for permission to court you formally," he said, "which is the proper way to phrase it in 1908, though what I actually mean is simpler than that. I want to continue what we've been doing, the letters, the conversations, the walks, with the understanding that I'm hoping in time to ask you to marry me. I think it's right to tell you that directly before I ask your father, because you are the person most involved in this arrangement, and I find I'm not very comfortable with arrangements that don't fully include the person they're most about." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her, steady and clear, exactly as he had looked at her in the market and in the sitting room on Wednesday and on the ridge and at the gate this morning. He had not changed the quality of his looking since the first time she had seen him, even when what she had given him to look at was not her best. That was the fact she kept returning to. He had seen her at the market and he had kept looking, and everything since had been what came from that decision. "I think," she said carefully, "that I'm very glad you said it that way." He waited. "And I think," she said, "that you should speak to my father." He looked at her steadily. and there was something in his expression then quiet and genuine, underneath the composure, that she felt in her chest like warmth. "Thank you," he said. Not "I see" and "thank you," which was how it had begun, just "thank you," plainly and fully. She looked at the fire and the good December light coming through the window and heard, distantly, her father moving around in his study, and felt the morning arrange itself around her like something that had been waiting to be this way for exactly the right amount of time. She knocked on her father's study door 20 minutes later. He said come in, and she came in, and he was sitting at his desk with the document he had apparently needed to attend to most urgently still folded and unopened on the corner. "He's going to ask you to speak with him," she said. Her father looked at her with the expression of a man who was trying very hard to look unsurprised. "Is he?" he said. "He's in the sitting room," she said. "I think you should go in." Her father stood up from his chair with a speed that suggested the urgency of the document had been somewhat invented, and straightened his jacket, and looked at her for a moment with a plainness that he rarely allowed himself, and that she recognized, lately, as one of the things she had undervalued for years. "Are you happy, Clara?" he said just that. She thought about the market. She thought about the servant's gate and the cloth stall and the crow on the fence post and the valley from the ridge and 6 weeks of letters, and a man who had looked at her clearly from the very first moment and decided, on the basis of what he saw, to stay. "Yes," she said, "I think I'm getting there." Her father patted her arm once, briefly, in the way he had since she was a child, and went out to the sitting room, and she heard the door close behind him, and she sat down in the chair at his desk and looked at the frozen garden through the study window and felt the day hold its breath for a moment and then exhale. It took about 15 minutes. She counted them by the clock on the study mantel without meaning to. At the end of 15 minutes, she heard voices in the hall, her father's and Edmund's, and the tone of both, and then silence, and then her father's footstep on the stairs to the upper floor, bypassing the study entirely with the tact of a man who understood that two people needed a moment. She went back to the sitting room. Edmund was standing at the window, looking out at the frozen garden on the south side of the house. He turned when she came in. She looked at him, he looked at her, the clock ticked, the fire settled. He said yes, Edmund said. She let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. Obviously, she said. He looked at her with that quality she had spent months learning to read, and now read easily, the warmth underneath the composure, the presence underneath the stillness. "I didn't take it for granted," he said. "No," she said, "I know you didn't." They stood on opposite sides of the sitting room, which was a small room and therefore not very far apart, and looked at each other in the good December light, and the arrangement of the morning, the frost outside, the fire inside, the gone quiet house, the distance between them that was not very great and was growing smaller, felt to Clara like the most specific thing she had ever been inside. "I have a question," she said. "All right," he said. "At the market," she said, "that Tuesday morning, when I sent you to the delivery entrance. Did you know who I was?" He looked at her for a moment, and she waited, because she had learned to wait for his answers and had found that the waiting was nearly always worth it. "I thought you might be," he said. "I had been told your name and a little about you, not much, only that you were your father's daughter and that you lived in the town. I wasn't certain it was you until you said the family doesn't receive commercial calls at the front gate." "Because that confirmed I was an Ashworth," she said. "Because that confirmed you knew exactly who lived there," he said. She absorbed this. He had known or suspected, and he had thanked her and walked away and come the next morning with the same deliberate, present attention he brought to everything. "You were very patient," she said. "I told you I've got better at it," he said. She crossed the room, not quickly, there was no urgency in it, nothing dramatic or rushed, but with the clear, unhurried intention that she was learning from him simply by being around him. She stood close enough that the distance was no longer a thing that needed crossing. "I'm glad you came to the market," she said, "and I'm glad you came back." "So am I," he said. Outside, the December morning was cold and bright and entirely specific, and the frozen garden was still and clear, and the fire behind them was warm, and the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, and nothing in the world was performing anything at all. They stood together in the sitting room, and it was enough, and it was real, and it was the kind of beginning that happens not with fanfare but with two people simply deciding, in the quiet space of an ordinary morning, to be honest with each other for the rest of their lives. The news that Lord Edmund Harwell of Harwell Park was formally courting Clara Ashworth reached the town of Caldwell in the way that all significant news reached small towns, not through any single announcement, but through 100 small revisions of the air, the way a season changes, gradually and then suddenly and then impossibly fast. Mrs. Bell heard it from the Ashworth's maid, who mentioned it to the grocer's wife, who told 3 people at Sunday church, each of whom told at least 2 more. By the second week of December, Caldwell had processed the news, formed opinions about it, and moved on to debating whether it would result in Clara leaving the town entirely and whether the Ashworths would sell the house. Clara was largely uninterested in what Caldwell thought. This was new. She had spent most of her life being carefully interested in what Caldwell thought, not because she was weak or easily led, but because she had confused the opinion of the town with something more substantial, something closer to fact. She was discovering, as December went on, that uninteresting herself from external opinion was harder than she had expected and easier than she had feared, and that the 2 things could be true at once. Louisa, who heard the news directly from Clara over tea at the Fenwick house on the Wednesday after Edmund's December visit, was quiet for a moment and then said, "He's going to be very good for you." Clara looked at her. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," Louisa said, choosing her words with the care that Clara had learned to recognize in her as genuine deliberation, "that he sees you, not the version you put forward when you're in company. He seems to see further back than that, and I think that's the thing you've always needed, even if you didn't know you needed it." Clara sat with this for a moment. Outside the Fenwick window, the December afternoon was going dark already, the way it did in Yorkshire from mid-November until February, so early and so completely that it felt personal. "You've thought about this," Clara said. "I've thought about you for 20 years, Louisa said plainly. "I'm allowed to have noticed things." This was true, and Clara felt the weight of it in the way you feel the weight of something only after it is named. Louisa had been her closest friend since they were 3 years old, and Clara had, in various ways and to various degrees, been performing for her for the better part of 2 decades. Not dishonestly, she had never lied to Louisa, but carefully. She had given Louisa the version of herself she was comfortable showing, and Louisa, with the intelligence she never displayed aggressively, had seen the rest of it anyway and said nothing, because she was Louisa and she knew when to wait. "I've been difficult," Clara said, not as an apology exactly, more as an acknowledgement. "You've been Clara," Louisa said. "You've also been difficult. The 2 aren't separate things." They drank their tea, and the afternoon went dark outside, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else on the subject, which was one of the mercies of a friendship long enough to have survived many subjects. Edmund came to Caldwell twice more before Christmas. The second visit, on a bright cold Thursday in the second week of December, was a family dinner. Her father and Edmund, Clara, and also her Aunt Margaret, who was her mother's older sister and who had come from Leeds for the occasion. Aunt Margaret was a woman of considerable intelligence and strong views, who had managed to hold both of these things in a society that did not particularly welcome strong views from women in 1908, by developing a manner of apparent mildness that Clara had always suspected was deliberate and strategic. She arrived on the train from Leeds on Wednesday evening and sat at the Ashworth dinner table in her good grey dress, and assessed Edmund Harwell for the full 3 hours of the meal with the quiet thoroughness of a person conducting a professional evaluation. Edmund bore this with complete equanimity. He spoke to Aunt Margaret as he spoke to everyone, directly, with genuine interest, without any of the small performances of charm that men sometimes put on for older women they feel they ought to impress. He asked her what she thought of a debate she had apparently had with Clara's father about the proposed road from Caldwell to York, having heard it mentioned, and Aunt Margaret, who was not often given the opportunity to continue her arguments at the dinner table, found herself talking for 20 minutes about road infrastructure and land rights and the interests of local farmers, and Edmund listened and asked questions and disagreed, once on a specific point, in a way that was so measured and well supported that Aunt Margaret's eyes flickered with what Clara recognized as approval. After dinner, when Edmund had gone and the house was quieting into its evening routine, Aunt Margaret found Clara in the sitting room and sat down in the chair that was already becoming, in Clara's private mind, Edmund's chair, and folded her hands in her lap. "He's a serious man," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "Not solemn," Aunt Margaret continued, making the distinction carefully. "Solemn men are dull and slightly unkind. Serious men take things as they are, he takes you as you are. He has done from the beginning, Clara said. Then she paused and corrected herself, because she was practicing honesty and this was the right place to practice it. From the beginning and somewhat before, actually. Aunt Margaret looked at her with the expression of a woman who has heard something interesting and is deciding whether to pursue it. I was less than kind to him when we first met, Clara said. He was dressed plainly and I sent him to the servants' entrance before I knew who he was. He came to the house the next morning anyway. Aunt Margaret was silent for a moment, then she said, "What did you learn from that?" Not how embarrassing, not what did he say, not any of the things a different person would have said first. What did you learn from that? This, Clara thought, was why her aunt had managed strong views in an unhelpful world for 62 years. She had always asked the question that mattered. Quite a lot, Clara said. Her aunt nodded once and said no more about it, and they sat together in the sitting room in a companionable silence that felt, to Clara, like the particular peace that comes when you have said a true thing to someone who already knew it. The 3rd December visit, 3 days before Christmas, was shorter, a morning call, Edmund in the hall with his coat on and a tin of something from the Harwell Park kitchen under his arm, brought for the household, directed to Mrs. Gale with the same natural ease with which he did everything. They had half an hour by the fire while her father spoke to a man about the wood delivery, and it was the most private half-hour they had yet had, and nothing happened in it that could not have been reported to a minister, but the closeness of it, the ordinary intimacy of two people who have decided to know each other and are now simply doing so, was something Clara felt in the quiet of that room as something permanent. He was going to his sister's house for Christmas. He had a younger sister named Harriet, married to a solicitor in Harrogate, and they had 3 children who expected their uncle at Christmas and were apparently quite firm about this, and he would be back in Caldwell in January for the formal announcement. The formal announcement. The County Gazette, the church banns, the visiting cards. The machinery of public life in 1908 that surrounded a courtship like scaffolding around a building, necessary and temporary, and eventually removed. She was not especially interested in the machinery. She was interested in what it surrounded. "Merry Christmas," she said at the front door on his way out. "Merry Christmas," he said. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll write." "I know you will," she said. He went out and the cold December morning received him, and she stood at the open door for a moment watching him walk up the lane until Pepper came and stood beside her, and she looked down at him and felt his old warmth against her leg and thought, "All right, all right." Christmas in the Ashworth house was quiet and comfortable and better than it had been in recent years, though Clara could not have said precisely why except that she felt more present in it. William came home from school on the 22nd, taller than he had been in September, and with the particular energy of a boy coming home for the first time in 4 months, and he talked for approximately 3 consecutive days about the cricket match before noticing that his sister seemed different in some way he couldn't identify and asking, with the directness of 16-year-old boys, "Are you all right?" "Very," she said. He looked at her. "You're different," he said. "Am I?" she said. "Less," he searched for the word, "less fixed," he said finally. "You used to seem very fixed. Like you'd decided everything already." She looked at her brother. He had their mother's eyes, she had always thought so, and her mother's quality of seeing, which was direct and kind at once, and she had apparently not paid enough attention to him for the past several years. "You're right," she said. "I was fixed. I'm working on being less so." He seemed to accept this and moved on to asking what was for dinner, because he was 16 and had been traveling since the morning and was hungry, and that was absolutely fine with Clara, who went to tell Mrs. Gale and found herself genuinely glad to have him home. In the full, present way she was practicing being glad about things. Christmas Day was the 4 of them herself, her father, William, and Aunt Margaret, who had stayed from Leeds, and Pepper in front of the fire, and the good dinner Mrs. Gale made every year, and the exchange of small, sensible gifts, and the particular quality of a family afternoon that is not dramatic or remarkable but is real, in the same way a fire is real, giving warmth without needing to explain itself. In the evening, when her father and aunt were talking and William had fallen asleep on the settee with Pepper beside him, Clara went up to her room and read Edmund's Christmas letter, which had arrived 2 days earlier. It was 3 pages, and it told her about Harriet's house and the children and the particular chaos of Christmas with people under 10 in a household, and it made her laugh twice, and at the end it said, I find that the question of what the new year will bring has never interested me less, since I already know the most important answer. I'll be in Caldwell in January. I hope that is welcome. She folded the letter and put it back in its envelope, and added it to the pile in the drawer of her writing desk, 22 letters now, going back to October, and sat for a moment in the Christmas evening quiet, and felt something in her chest that was warm and steady and entirely without performance. She was not the same person who had stood at the market stall in September and directed a stranger to the delivery entrance. She was the same in name and face and address, but something in the substance of her had shifted, not violently but permanently, the way a river shifts when a new channel opens gradually at first, and then completely, and then it is simply the river going the way it goes, and there is no going back to the old direction. She did not want to go back. She was beginning to understand that forward, in the direction she was going with the person she was becoming, was considerably more interesting. January came in the way January always comes in Yorkshire, cold and determined, and without particular apology. The valley went grey, the trees already bare, the fields stripped and frost-hard. The lane outside the Ashworth house turned slippery in the mornings, and Clara began taking her walks later, at 10 or 11, when the frost had at least partially yielded to the pale winter sun. She had written 3 letters to Edmund over Christmas and received 3 in return, and the letters had, if anything, deepened during the holiday weeks, more personal, more specific, covering ground that the formality of their sit-down visits had not quite reached. He wrote about his father more, about the specific quality of grief that had lasted years in the way he had not expected it to, and about the changes he had made at Harwell Park in the years since, not just to the land and the house, but to himself. She wrote about her mother, carefully and honestly, things she had not said aloud in years. She wrote about the 11-year-old girl who had stood at a grave in the church in the west side of town, and decided, in the wordless way that children decide things, that the safest thing was to be very good at life so that life could not surprise her. She had written, "I think I have been trying to be very good at life for 12 years, and I think it has made me safe and correct, and rather less useful than I could have been." He had written back, "I think you are being harder on yourself than the evidence warrants. You have been these things, and you are also, clearly, someone with the capacity to examine them, which is not common. That is worth more than any number of years of being simply correct." She had read this 3 times and then put the letter away because she was going to cry if she read it again, and she preferred not to cry if she could help it. Another habit she was examining, and another one she was less sure she wanted to keep. Edmund arrived on the 15th of January on a Tuesday, which was market day, and he came into Caldwell through the market square, which was full and busy in its usual Tuesday way, and she was there. She had not planned to be there, she had not gone looking for a repetition, some neat reversal of the morning in September. But she had gone to buy cheese and say good morning to the grocer, as she did every Tuesday, and she was standing near the cloth stall, not at it, not touching any bolts of fabric, simply passing, when she looked up and saw him crossing the square toward her. He saw her at the same moment. She did not send him to the delivery entrance. She did not assess his jacket or notice the state of his boots. She simply looked at him and felt, in the middle of the busy Tuesday market with its noise and its smell of bread and cold air and the general cheerful commerce of a working town, the particular clarity of someone who knows exactly where they are and is glad to be there. He crossed the square to her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Are you heading to the house?" "I am," he said, "though I'm a little early." "Walk with me," she said. "I was just leaving." They walked through the market together, side by side, through the crowd and the stalls and the ordinary Tuesday life of Caldwell, and nobody who saw them would have thought anything remarkable was happening, because nothing remarkable appeared to be happening. A woman and a man walking together through a market, entirely ordinary, entirely unremarkable. And entirely the best thing Clara Ashworth had felt since the day she climbed the ridge and sat on a fence post and looked down at everything she had been and decided to stand at a different height. He stayed for lunch, which was the first time he had stayed for a full meal at the Ashworth house without a formal invitation, and the 3 of them, Edmund, her father, and Clara, sat at the dining table with the winter light coming through the window and talked for 2 hours about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the comfortable mixture of both that marks a meal between people who are beginning to be a family. After lunch, when her father went to rest, he had been sleeping in the afternoon since October, a quiet concession to a winter that had been harder on him than he admitted. Edmund and Clara walked in the garden, which in January was mostly mud and bare branches and the occasional determined sparrow, and they walked the four corners of the small walled enclosure and talked about the announcement, which was to be placed in the County Gazette that week, and about the spring. And about a trip he was proposing to York when the weather improved, to take her to see things he thought she would like. What things, she said. A particular bookshop, he said, a walk along the city walls, a museum with a collection of natural history that I think you'd find interesting, and a place I know that makes exceptional coffee, which is not as common in Yorkshire as it should be. She smiled. That's a very specific list. I've been building it since October, he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. He stopped too. In the bare January garden their breath made small clouds in the cold air, the same as they had at the gate in December, the same as they would, she thought, on many future mornings. Edmund, she said. He looked at her. I want to tell you something, she said, about September. He waited, with the patience she had come to rely on. I was unkind to you at the market, she said. I have thought about it many times since then, and I know why I did it. I looked at you and I made a decision in about 10 seconds and I acted on it and the decision was wrong. Not just wrong about who you were, wrong in itself. I would have been wrong to speak that way to anyone. He looked at her steadily. I know you gave me a way out, she said. On the Wednesday morning when you said you'd arrived late and missed the market. I know what that was, and I took it and I've been grateful for it, but I want you to know that I haven't forgotten what I did and I don't intend to. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, I know you haven't, I could see that from the Wednesday morning, that's partly why I stayed. Partly, she said. You were also, he said, the most interesting person I'd met in a long time. That was the other part. She looked at him in the January garden, in the cold and the bare branches and the determined sparrows, and felt the morning hold steady around her. All right, she said. They walked the last corner of the garden and went inside, where Mrs. Gale had left fresh tea in the sitting room, and the fire was good and Pepper was exactly where he always was, and the house was warm, and the County Gazette announcement would run on Friday, and the formal machinery of their public life together was about to begin. But before all of that there was this, 2 people in a sitting room in January, with tea and a fire and a dog asleep on the hearthrug, speaking plainly to each other about what had happened and what it had meant, and finding, in the plain speaking, something more durable than anything that had come before it. That was the foundation, not the announcement, not the arrangement, not the title or the house or the careful observance of social form. This, 2 people deciding in a small room in a Yorkshire winter to tell each other the truth and keep on telling it. Everything that came after was built on that. The announcement in the County Gazette ran on Friday, the 17th of January 1909. It was 4 lines long in the standard form, the name of the parties, the names of their fathers, a note that the engagement was to be announced formally at a gathering at the Ashworth House in February. 4 lines set in small type on the 3rd page among other notices of business and local record. Clara read it at breakfast and thought about how much had happened to produce those 4 lines, and how none of it was visible in them, and how that was probably as it should be. The response from Caldwell was immediate and considerable. The Ashworths received 6 letters of congratulation before noon on Friday, 3 more on Saturday, and a stream of callers over the following week that turned the sitting room into something approaching a social hub, which was not the sitting room's natural character, and which Pepper found deeply upsetting. Mrs. Gale baked an additional cake on both Monday and Wednesday to accommodate the callers. Her father shook a great many hands, and said the same gracious, appropriate things repeatedly with what Clara thought was remarkable stamina. Clara smiled, answered questions, accepted congratulations, and felt, throughout all of it, a quiet distance from the performance that she recognized as something new. She was not detached, she was warm toward people she liked, genuinely pleased by the genuine pleasure of friends. But she was no longer measuring the morning against the social ledger in her head, noting who came and who didn't, what was said and whether it was the right thing, whether her own responses had been observed and judged correctly. She was simply present, which was, she was discovering, significantly less tiring. Louisa came on Saturday morning and they escaped the callers by walking. Louisa was very good at appearing to have just left and creating the impression that she and Clara had a prior engagement, which they did not, but which they quickly invented in the form of a walk to the ridge, because they had not done that together and the January morning was cold but dry. They walked up the lane past the farriers, past the point where Edmund had been directed to the delivery entrance, up the long rise to the footpath that ran beside the river and then climbed to the ridge. The valley below was winter bare and very clear, the kind of clarity that only comes in cold, still air where every detail sharpens. The town looked small and specific and entirely itself. Louisa looked at it for a long time. "I'm going to miss you," she said, "when you go to Harwell Park." "I'll come back," Clara said. "It's not far." "It's not the distance," Louisa said in her direct, honest way. "It's that you'll be different. You're already different. You'll keep being different." Clara looked at her friend, at the round pink cheeks and the honest eyes and the 20 years of quiet, loyal attention, and felt, behind her sternum, a particular kind of ache that comes from something being real enough to lose. "I'll come back," she said again, "and you'll be different too. Things change, it doesn't mean they go away." Louisa looked at her sideways with the expression that meant she understood this was true and wished it weren't slightly different from what it sounded like. "He's a good man," Louisa said. "I know," Clara said. "Are you sure of it, properly sure?" Clara thought about the market. She thought about Wednesday morning and the servant's entrance and 2 seconds of silence and "I see" and "thank you." She thought about 45 minutes in the sitting room and 2 hours in the rain. She thought about the ridge and the river and the letters and December in the hall and January in the garden. She thought about a man who had decided from the first to keep looking and had never given her any reason to doubt that he would. "Properly," she said. Louisa nodded once, with the finality of someone who has asked the question they most needed to ask and received the answer they were hoping for. They sat on the fence post stile together for a while, 2 women on a fence in January, in a field above a valley town, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said, and then they climbed down and walked back into town and split up at the market square, and Clara went home and found the callers had mostly gone and the sitting room was quiet and Mrs. Gale had saved her a piece of cake. In February, the formal engagement party took place at the Ashworth house on a Saturday evening. This was Aunt Margaret's enterprise, conducted from the house where she was staying as a guest for the duration, with the efficiency of a woman who had organized many things and found the organizing of them satisfying in the same way some people find solving mathematics satisfying, not from vanity, but from the pleasure of things correctly arranged. Tables were hired, and flowers, and the good china that normally lived in the high cabinet in the dining room was washed and set out, and Mrs. Gale was given additional assistance in the form of a woman from the town who cooked for hire, and between the 3 of them a very creditable spread was produced. Edmund came the day before and stayed at the inn in the market square, which was the nearest respectable accommodation, and Clara thought about this arrangement, him at the inn, her at the Ashworth house, 300 yards apart, and found it slightly absurd and entirely proper and not worth any complaint, since the whole machinery of engagement and announcement was a temporary structure and spring was not far off. The party was attended by 40 people, which was most of the social layer of Caldwell that the Ashworths moved through, plus a handful of Edmund's associates and the representative of his family, his sister Harriet, who came without her husband, and with the expression of a woman who has been looking forward to this meeting for some time. Harriet Harwell, now Harriet Dorn, after her marriage to the Harrogate solicitor, was 31, 2 years older than Edmund, with the same dark eyes and the same quality of steady attention, though hers was warmer on the surface, less contained, and she made it immediately clear within 5 minutes of meeting Clara at the door that she was going to have her own opinion and had already partly formed it. "He's told me about you," Harriet said, taking both of Clara's hands in a way that was slightly more intimate than the occasion strictly required, but felt entirely natural. "All of it, I hope," Clara said. Harriet looked at her, a quick, direct look. "He told me about the market," she said, low enough that no one nearby could hear. "He tells me most things, eventually." Clara met her gaze, "And," she said. "And," Harriet said, "I think the fact that you know he told me, and that you're looking at me like that instead of pretending you don't know what I'm talking about, is exactly the right response." Clara looked at her for a moment longer, and then she laughed, a real laugh, genuine and unguarded, and Harriet laughed too, and they were, from that moment, something that was recognizably the beginning of a friendship, the kind that takes root fast because both people are tired of growing things slowly and want to get on with it. Edmund watched this from across the room with the expression of a man who has been slightly anxious about a particular meeting and has just discovered he needn't have been. The party was, by any reasonable account, a success. The food was excellent, the wine was adequate, the conversations were the kind that cover too many subjects at once and arrive nowhere, and are none the worse for it. Clara moved through the room with a lightness she had not felt at social occasions before, not because nothing mattered, but because the right things mattered and the other things did not, and she knew which were which. She saw things she would not have seen in September. She noticed that the grocer's wife, who had always struck her as a woman of no particular depth, was speaking to Harriet with a genuine intelligence about the economics of small market towns that was quite remarkable. She noticed that old Mr. Fenwick, Louis's father, who she had always thought of primarily as the father of someone she knew rather than as a person in his own right, had a quality of listening during conversations that was similar to Edmund's, a patience and fullness of attention that she now recognized as a thing of value. She noticed that her father, watching Edmund from across the room with a quiet satisfaction, looked more at ease than he had in years. She stood beside Edmund for most of the evening in the way that couples do at these events, not joined at the shoulder, not performing their togetherness for the room, but simply present in each other's vicinity, speaking to their guests while remaining aware of each other in the easy, constant way of people who have already settled into a kind of belonging. At one point, late in the evening, when most of the guests had gathered in small groups and the formal part of the occasion had relaxed into the social part, Edmund came to stand beside her at the window and looked out at the February night and said, quietly, so that no one else could hear, "How are you doing?" Not "Are you well?" or "Is everything going correctly?" or any of the social forms, just "How are you doing?" present tense. "Right now, I'm very well," she said, in the same quiet register. "I'm looking at people I've known for years and seeing them differently." "How so?" he said. "More," she said, "just more." He looked out the window for a moment. "That tends to happen," he said, "when you stop looking for confirmation of what you already think." She looked at him. "Is that what I was doing?" "It's what most people do," he said. "It's comfortable. The world makes more sense when it confirms your existing picture of it." "And now," she said. "Now," he said, "you're looking without the picture." She thought about this. She thought about the cloth stall and the market and the servant's entrance and the crow on the fence post, and the valley from the ridge and 22 letters and the bare January garden, and everything she had seen and thought and felt and learned in the 5 months since a man with mud on his boots had asked her for directions, and she had decided in 10 seconds and without examination exactly what kind of man he was. "It's more interesting," she said. "Most things are," he said, "when you look properly." They stayed at the window for a moment longer, in the noise and warmth of the party, quiet and adjacent, and then someone called Edmund's name from across the room and he went. And Clara turned back to the room and found Harriet at her elbow with a glass of wine and an expression of unmistakable approval. "He's happier than I've seen him in years," Harriet said. "He seems very settled," Clara said. "He's settled because of you," Harriet said, without particular ceremony. "He was fine before, he is better now." "There is a difference." Clara looked across the room at Edmund, who was talking to old Mr. Fenwick with the same quality of full attention he gave to everything, and thought about what it meant to make someone better not by completing them. That was not how it worked. She was beginning to understand, but by being honest enough that they could be more completely themselves. She was learning this. She was learning it from him partly and from the months of letters, and from standing on a fence post above a valley and thinking hard about what seeing clearly actually required. But she was also learning it from inside herself, from whatever part of her had been waiting for the right conditions, the way a seed waits for rain. She had been given rain, in the form of a man who had thanked her for misdirecting him and come back anyway, and something in her had opened that she thought had probably always been there, wanting to. The party ended at 11, which was late for Caldwell in February, and the guests left in 2s and 3s, bundled against the cold, their voices going quiet as the front door closed behind each group until the house was its own quiet self again, full of the aftermath of an evening, half-empty glasses, moved chairs, the particular exhausted warmth of a room that has contained a great many people and is now returning to itself. Edmund left last, or nearly last. Harriet had gone ahead in the cart that would take her back to the inn, and there were only Clara, her father, and Aunt Margaret in the hall. Edmund shook her father's hand for what felt this time like a different kind of handshake, less formal, more genuine, the handshake of a man who has crossed a threshold and knows it. He said good night to Aunt Margaret, who said good night back with the warmth she reserved for people who had earned her respect. And then he turned to Clara. in the hallway of her family's house, under the good lamp that her father had bought the year before, with the remnants of the party around them and the February cold waiting outside the door, Clara looked at Edmund Harwell and Edmund Harwell looked at Clara Ashworth, and neither of them said very much, because very little needed to be said. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He put on his coat and hat, and the maid opened the front door, and the February night came in briefly cold and dark and smelling of frost, and then he was through it and gone, and the door closed, and Clara stood in the warm hallway and felt the evening settle around her into something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, not as a grand event but as a quiet mark, a point of reference. This is when things became what they were going to be. Her father put a hand briefly on her shoulder as he went past toward his study. Aunt Margaret said she was going up and it had been a very fine evening. In the crisp way she said things she genuinely meant. The maid began to clear the glasses. Clara stood in the hall for another moment, alone, and then she went upstairs to her room and sat at her writing desk, and the pile of letters in the drawer, 23 now, with the one that had arrived that morning, sat in the drawer and she did not open it, because she did not need to read them. She knew them. She had read each one enough times to have the best parts of them almost by heart, not from repetition, but from the quality of attention she had brought to them, the same quality she was learning to bring to everything. She thought about what Louisa had said on the ridge, "You'll keep being different." She thought about this, not with sadness exactly, and not with the pure, uncomplicated happiness of someone who has everything they wanted and nothing left to reckon with something more honest than either of those things. She had changed and would keep changing, and the change was not the ending of who she had been but the opening of who she was going to be, and both things were true at once and had to be carried together. She took out a piece of paper and wrote one line, not a letter to anyone, not a note for any purpose, just a mark. "I am, for the first time, entirely unsettled about my future and entirely at peace about it." I didn't know those two things could be simultaneous. She folded it and put it with the other note in the drawer, the one she had written in October, about looking at things from a long way up, and sat for a moment with the drawer closed, and the cold February night outside her window, and the whole settled particular reality of her life arranged around her. Tomorrow Edmund would be at the inn down the square. In 2 days he would go back to Harwell Park. In spring they would be married, probably in the church on the west side of town, with the Ashworths and the Harwells and Caldwell and Harriet Dorn and Louisa and old Mr. Fenwick all arranged in the pews. And whatever that morning was going to be, it was going to be real and specific and not at all like the version of it she had imagined a year ago, when she had thought she knew what marriage would look like and who it would be with and how she would feel about it. She had not known. She had thought she knew, which was not the same thing, and the not sameness was the most important thing she had learned. She went to bed at 11:30 and lay in the dark listening to the February wind move around the eaves of the house, and did not plan anything, and did not rehearse anything, and did not compose a single sentence of performance. She simply lay in her own particular life and let it be what it was, and fell asleep in the middle of a thought about the market stall and the cloth and the green wool she had been touching when a man with muddy boots said, "Excuse me, miss." She was almost smiling when she fell asleep, which was a thing she had not done in a long time, and which she intended from now on to do much more often. The wedding was set for the 12th of April, which was early spring in Yorkshire, which is to say, possibly cold, possibly mild, almost certainly unpredictable in some specific meteorological way that would be remembered afterward and spoken of with either fondness or amusement, depending on what it turned out to be. Clara's father had asked the vicar about April, and the vicar had said that April was always a risk in Yorkshire, but that God had a particular regard for hope, and spring weddings specifically, and they should proceed with reasonable confidence. Her father had thanked him and come home and told Clara this, and she had laughed, which was what he had been hoping for. The months between February and April were busy in the way that months before a large event are always busy, full of small tasks that each took less time than expected but accumulated into a continuous low-level occupation. There were dressmakers to be consulted, and flowers to be arranged, and a lunch to be organized for the day before with the families who were traveling from further away. There were the practicalities of what came after the wedding to be thought about and spoken about carefully, the move to Harwell Park, the handing over of the management of the Ashworth house to a tenant, the conversations about what Clara would bring with her and what would stay. Edmund came to Caldwell 3 more times between February and April, twice alone and once with Harriet, who arrived as though she had always been there, and immediately developed strong opinions about the flowers. Clara let Harriet have the flowers. This was partly because Harriet's opinions were genuinely better informed than her own, and partly because she found she had no particular need to win the arrangement. She had always been good at the small competitions of social life, the quiet maneuvering for position, the subtle assertion of preference that maintained one's standing in a group, and she was discovering that stepping back from those competitions cost her nothing, less than nothing. It left her with a kind of freedom she had not known she was missing. Aunt Margaret, who had gone back to Leeds in February and come back in March to help with preparations, watched Clara moving through the days of wedding organization with an attentiveness that Clara noticed but did not comment on. One morning in late March, they were sitting at the dining table going through the order of the wedding lunch, and Aunt Margaret set her pencil down and looked at her niece. "You are different," she said, in the same direct way she said everything, in a way that I think your mother would have recognized. Clara looked up from the list. "Your mother," Aunt Margaret said, "was the most unsentimental person I have ever loved. She saw things as they were and she said what she thought and she did not perform contentment. What she felt fully. I see that in you now, in a way I did not see it before." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her mother had been dead for 12 years. She was often present in the house in the way that people who have lived in a place remain present in it, but she was rarely spoken of directly. "I didn't know that about her," Clara said, "about the seeing things." "You were 11, Aunt Margaret said. "You knew what a child knows." "What else?" Clara said. "What else should I know about her?" Aunt Margaret looked at her for a moment, deciding, Clara thought, how much of this to open, and then she said, "She had your mind, that particular quality of taking everything in and arranging it quickly, but she was kinder with it than you have been. She never used her seeing to sort people. She was interested in them first." Clara sat with this. The morning light was coming through the dining room window and making long rectangles on the table, the way it did in late March when the sun was finally getting high enough again to come in at the right angle. "I'm working on that," she said. "I know you are," her aunt said. "That's why I'm telling you. It's worth knowing that you're moving toward her." She picked up her pencil again and returned to the list. Clara returned to hers. They worked in silence for a while and the morning was quiet, and neither of them said anything else about Clara's mother, and both of them felt her presence in the room as something warm. Edmund came to Caldwell for the last time as an unmarried man on the 10th of April, a Saturday, 2 days before the wedding. He arrived in a proper carriage this time, the first time Clara had seen him use a carriage rather than walking or riding, and he brought with him a small crate of furniture from Harwell Park that he thought she might like to have in the rooms that would be hers, including a chair from his mother's sitting room that he wanted her to have if she wanted it, and a painting of the Yorkshire coast from his father's study that he had always thought was very good, and that he thought she might like to hang if she chose. She went out to meet the carriage in the April morning, which was cold and bright and smelling of the first suggestion of green things. He climbed down and looked at her, and she looked at him, and it was the same as it had always been. The two of them, reading each other, in the particular depth of understanding that had accumulated over 8 months of letters and visits and honesty. "2 days, he said. 2 days, she said. "Are you ready?" he said. She thought about this. The true answer was complicated, because ready was a word that implied you had finished preparing, and she had not finished preparing. She suspected she would never quite finish, that the work of being the person she was becoming was not a project with an end point but a practice without one. But she was ready in the sense that mattered. She was present, and she was willing, and she was more honest with herself than she had been at any previous point in her life. "Yes," she said, "I am." He looked at her for a moment longer with that expression she knew so well now, the one she had first seen at the market and had not been able to read, and which she now understood as simply him, simply the quality of Edmund Harwell paying full attention to something he valued. Then he said, "Good, come and look at the chair. I want to know what you think." She laughed and they went around to the back of the carriage, and she looked at the chair, which was a beautiful thing, old oak with a curved back and a worn leather seat that had the softness of something loved for years, and she said she would like it very much, and he looked pleased in the way he looked pleased, which was quietly and from the inside, and they carried it through the front gate and into the house together, which was not how the thing should properly have been done, but which neither of them thought to question. The night before the wedding, Clara sat at her writing desk for the last time in the room that had been hers since childhood. She had spent 23 years in this room. She had read in it and cried in it and thought in it and written in it and slept in it and looked out its window at the Ashworth garden in every season, and in the morning she was going to leave it, and she was not entirely sure how to feel about that. She opened the drawer of the writing desk and took out the 2 pieces of paper she had put there, the one from October and the one from February, and read them both. I have been looking at things from a long way up, and thinking that was the same as seeing clearly. And I am, for the first time, entirely unsettled about my future and entirely at peace about it. She took out a fresh piece of paper and wrote a third one. Tomorrow I'll carry these with me. Everything they were about has already happened. The person who wrote them is almost, not quite, gone. She put all 3 pieces of paper in the small writing case that was already packed with the things she was taking to Harwell Park, because she had decided to keep them, not as proof of anything but as a record, the kind of record you keep not to be reminded of who you were but to be reminded of the distance between who you were and who you are becoming, because that distance is the thing worth measuring. She looked around the room, the bed, the window, the oval mirror, the chair in the corner with the shawl her mother had given her aunt who had given her in a box when she turned 21. All of it real and specific and hers. She went to bed without planning anything, because she had learned not to plan things she couldn't control, and tomorrow was not a thing she could control. Tomorrow was a thing she was going to meet, at 10 o'clock, in the church on the west side of town, wearing a dress of pale gold silk that she had chosen with Louisa on a Wednesday in March that she would remember for the rest of her life. She was going to meet it as herself, not the performed self, not the careful self, not the self who looked at things from a long way up and found the arrangement orderly, but the self who was learning, every day and imperfectly, to stand at the right height and look at things the size they actually are. She lay in the dark room of her childhood and listened to the April night, which was carrying faintly the first sounds of spring, something moving in the garden, and a bird somewhere up the lane, singing in the dark before dawn as birds sometimes do in April, as if they cannot quite contain what is coming. She fell asleep to the sound of it and slept deeply and did not dream, and when she woke in the morning the light through the curtain was gold. She lay in it for a moment, in the familiar room that would, after today, be familiar in memory but no longer in daily life, and she thought, all right. All right. She got up. The 12th of April arrived clear. Not the pale, thin clear of winter mornings, but the full, real clear of a spring day that has decided to be spring without qualification. The sky above Caldwell was the particular blue of April at its best, and the trees on the south side of the valley were in that first flush of green that doesn't last more than a week before it deepens and becomes ordinary. The hedgerows along the lane had come into blossom, the thorn trees white and full and smelling of something between sweetness and green wood that was entirely specific to that week of the year, and could not be reproduced or described adequately, only stood inside. Clara stood inside it. She had come downstairs in her dressing gown at 7 and gone into the garden, which was something she had never done before on any morning, the garden before breakfast, before the day's proper arrangements, before anything, and stood on the stone path between the rose beds, which were not yet in flower but were full of tight, determined buds, and breathed the April morning. She was not doing this dramatically. She was not standing there with her arms spread or her face tilted up, the way people in stories face important mornings. She was simply standing on the path in her dressing gown with her hair loose and her feet still slightly cold, breathing in a garden she had lived beside for 23 years and had in the last 8 months begun to actually see. The roses would bloom in June. She would see them from Harwell Park by then. She would come back for the summer, her father had said, whenever she wished, and she intended to take him at his word. She would sit in this garden in June and the roses would be the same roses they always were, her same old familiar roses, but she would look at them differently than she had looked at them before, and they would be, on account of that, actually more beautiful. She went back inside and the maid helped her dress, and by 9 o'clock she was in the ivory and gold dress that she had chosen with Louisa, and that turned out on the actual morning to be exactly right, not showy, not dull, but simply the most herself she had ever looked, which was, she thought, what a wedding dress ought to do. Her father came to the bottom of the stairs when she came down. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has many feelings and has selected, from among them, the one that is appropriate for the occasion and the one that is true, and has found to his relief that they are the same one. "Your mother would have been very pleased," he said. She went to him and took his arm and they stood in the hallway of the house together for a moment, her father, who was also different than she had seen him, clearer, more visible to her, having been looked at properly for the last several months, and the hallway was warm and quiet and full of the particular piece of a thing about to begin. Louisa was at the church already as maid of honor, having arrived early in the way that Louisa managed things practical ahead of schedule with the unobtrusive competence that was her particular quality. Harriet was there with her 3 children who were dressed with enormous care and were by the evidence of their expressions aware that something significant was happening and were being very good about it, which required considerable effort on the part of the youngest. Aunt Margaret was in the 3rd pew in her best gray, with the expression of a woman who is doing well at containing a feeling she rarely shows. The church was full. Caldwell turned out for a wedding. Clara had expected that and had made her peace with it, with being looked at, admired, assessed, observed. She had not made peace with it by becoming indifferent to it, but by accepting it as part of the day's reality. People who cared about the Ashworths, or about the Harwells, or simply about the particular human drama of 2 people beginning a life together, they were here and they were welcome, and she could look at them without performing for them, which was a distinction she had not been able to make a year ago. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and the church was full of people she had known her entire life, and the light came through the tall south-facing windows in that specifically church way, in long shafts of gold and dust, and at the end of the aisle Edmund was standing and looking at her with the same expression he had always worn when he looked at her, full, present, direct, and she walked toward him in the good light and felt, step by step, that she was not walking toward something new, but toward something that had been coming toward her since a September morning in a market square, and that the distance between that morning and this one was exactly the distance of everything she had needed to learn. She arrived at the end of the aisle. Her father put her hand in Edmund's and stepped back. Edmund looked at her, she looked at him. "Good morning," he said, in a tone just below the vicar's earshot. She almost laughed. "Good morning," she said. The vicar began. The words were the old words, the ones that had been said in churches like this one for hundreds of years, that were worn smooth with use, that everyone in the building had heard before, and that meant, on this particular morning, something that was entirely their own. Clara heard them clearly and thought about each one as it was said, which was not how she had imagined listening to them, but which seemed right, given everything. She made her promises. She meant them in the specific, present tense, not as abstract intentions, but as commitments she understood the weight of and accepted anyway, which is the only honest way to make a promise. Edmund made his. His voice was steady and direct, as it always was, and she heard in it the same quality she had heard the first time he had ever spoken to her, at the market, when he had asked for directions and she had given him the wrong answer, and he had said, "I see and thank you," the quality of a person who was fully there. She was fully there too. That was the thing she had carried with her from the September market to the April church. The intention, imperfect and daily and ongoing, to be where she was and look at what she was looking at and mean what she said. She meant what she said. They walked back down the aisle together in the April light, and the church was full of the sound of people who were glad, and Harriet was crying in the way that Harriet cried, which was thoroughly and without embarrassment, and Louisa was not crying but her eyes were very bright, and Aunt Margaret was looking straight ahead with an expression that was the opposite of crying, which is what you do when you are feeling something very large and have decided to hold it rather than let it go. Her father was looking at the floor. They came out of the church into the April morning. The yard was green and the trees were in that first bloom of leaf, and the air smelled of blossom, and the sky was the full April blue, and the whole valley was arranged around them as it always was, rooftops, church spire, 4 lanes fanning outward, the ridge to the south and the river below it, and Clara stood in the middle of it with Edmund beside her, and felt the whole of it as specific and present and entirely real. "How do you feel?" Edmund said beside her. She thought about this, because she always thought about things she was asked now before she answered. "Present," she said. "Entirely present." He looked at her with the expression that was his particular expression, the one she had first seen at the market and not been able to read, and that she now read easily and with great clarity, and that meant, as near as she could translate it, "I see you, exactly as you are, and I'm not going anywhere." "Good," he said. They stood in the April churchyard, and the morning was full and clear and specific in every detail, and the roses in the yard were not yet in flower but were full of buds, and everything was beginning. Harwell Park was not what Clara had imagined, which was, she had come to understand, entirely the right outcome. She had imagined it from the outside, from the name, from the county reputation, from the particular way people in Caldwell spoke of it, which was the way people speak of things they have heard about rather than known. She had imagined something large and formal and slightly cold, the kind of house that wears its history like armor. What she found was a house that had been loved for a long time by people who were not greatly interested in performance. It was old, as Edmund had said in his letters, older than it looked, with parts that dated back centuries hidden under the surface of the later additions. But those additions had been made by people who wanted to live in the house, not simply to possess it, and the result was a place that had been altered by use and comfort and a genuine interest in the day-to-day rather than by the desire to impress. The rooms were good-sized and well-lit. The furniture was old but not ostentatiously so, the kind of old that comes from things being used and kept rather than acquired and displayed. The library was the size of the Ashworth sitting room and dining room combined, and contained books that had clearly been read, not arranged, which Clara noticed immediately and felt, in response to a warmth she had not expected. The grounds were extensive and in mid-April, in the full rush of spring green, so beautiful that she stopped in the doorway of the garden room the first morning and simply looked at them for a while. Edmund came to stand beside her. "It's a lot at once," he said. "You don't have to take it all in today." "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to, I'm just looking." He looked with her for a moment. Outside, the grounds stretched away, the formal garden near the house, and then the kitchen garden behind its wall, and then beyond that the park itself, where the old trees were enormous and the grass was long and full of early flowers. "I'll show you the kitchen garden," he said. "There's a woman named Agnes who has run it for 20 years and who has opinions about everything. I think you'll like her." "Does she grow gooseberries?" Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "Why?" "I've become very interested in gooseberry jam," she said, "for reasons I'll explain another time." He gave her the expression that meant he was amused in the particular private way she had come to recognize, and went to get his coat, and they walked in the April grounds together, and she was shown the kitchen garden and introduced to Agnes, who was a woman of about 50 with dirt on her hands and a manner that was warm and direct in equal measure, and who looked at Clara with the same assessing quality that Clara had once turned on everyone and now received gracefully. Because she understood what it was and what it was for. "She'll do," Agnes said to Edmund, in a tone that was not rude but was absolutely not trying to be subtle. "I was told you have opinions," Clara said. Agnes looked at her with a slight change of expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one. "I do," she said. "Good," Clara said, "so do I. Will get on." And they did. Agnes grew gooseberries, as it happened, several varieties, and the following June she and Clara stood in the kitchen garden for an afternoon and made jam together in the kitchen and talked about plants and Yorkshire winters and the best way to manage a kitchen garden in clay soil. And it was one of the days that Clara would carry with her for the rest of her life, as an example of what happens when you are simply present with another person and let the conversation be what it is. The early weeks at Harwell Park were the learning weeks, the weeks of finding out where things were and how they worked, and who the people were who ran the daily life of the house and the estate. There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Pound, who had been there for 15 years and who managed the house with a competence that Clara found both admirable and slightly intimidating, until she understood that it was not a competence that excluded her but one that simply needed to know where she fitted in, and once that was established, in a direct, practical conversation in the housekeeper's room in the first week, Mrs. Pound became one of the most useful and straightforward people in her life. There was a land agent named Albert Crane who managed the farms on the estate, and who initially met Clara with the polite, careful manner of a man who was not sure what kind of interest a new wife would take in the business of the land and was reserving judgment. She solved this by asking him a direct question at their first meeting about the drainage issues in the lower field that Edmund had mentioned in one of his October letters, and he answered it in detail, and then asked a follow-up question, and they had a conversation that lasted 40 minutes, and at the end of which Albert Crane had revised his expectations upward considerably. Edmund watched all of this from a slight distance, with the expression of a man who has brought two things together that he suspected would work and is watching them work. He did not manage the introductions, he offered them, and then let Clara do what she did, which was be herself. The self she was becoming, the one that had been developing since September, was more capable of this than the self she had been before, less concerned with impression, more interested in the actual person across the table. She was still sharp, she was still quick, She still had opinions and formed them fast and was not especially patient with dishonesty or waste. But she was interested first, and she asked before she assessed, and she had learned, was still learning, that most people had depths that weren't visible in the first 10 seconds. She wrote to Louisa every week. This had been established as a compact before the wedding. Louisa's idea, offered plainly, "Write to me every week and I'll write back, and if either of us goes more than 10 days we have to confess it and explain." They had kept to this since April, and the letters were the same as the conversations they had been having since childhood, which is to say, honest, unhurried, and in no particular order. Louisa wrote about the town, about Mrs. Bells and the grocer and the fence dispute that had apparently still not been entirely resolved. Clara wrote about Harwell Park and Agnes, and the kitchen garden and Mrs. Pound and Albert Crane, and the particular quality of the park at dawn, which she had discovered by accident in the second week when she woke early and could not sleep, and went out into the morning before anyone else was about. She had stood in the park at 5:30 in the morning in early May, in the long grass under the old trees, and the light had been the particular quality of light that exists only in that early hour, pale and lavender at the edges, the sky not yet fully committed to day, and the birds had been in full voice, the kind of voice they save for the first hour of morning, and the whole park had been so completely, specifically beautiful that she had stood in it for 20 minutes without moving, and then gone back inside and written it down while it was still fully present. She wrote about it to Louisa, and Louisa wrote back, "I think you have always been this person, you just needed the right weather." Clara read this and thought about it for a long time, about what the right weather was and where it had come from. She thought about September and the market and Edmund's boots and her own quick, wrong assessment, and about the chain of events that had followed from that moment. Not the romantic chain, not the narrative of two people who met and fell in love, but the internal chain, the one that had been entirely about her own transformation. Edmund had given her a gift, but he had not given her the transformation. He had given her the conditions for it, the clean floor, the full attention, the honest engagement, the patience, and she had done the rest herself. That was important to her. Not because she wanted to diminish what he had done, which was considerable, and which she valued enormously, but because she needed to understand what was hers. The growth was hers. She had chosen it day by day in the way that all real growth is chosen, which is not dramatically, not in a single decision, but in 1,000 small ones, most of them invisible to anyone but the person making them. She had looked at herself and found the limitations. She had climbed down from the comfortable altitude of her own unexamined certainties and stood at the correct height and looked at things the size they actually were. She had written notes in drawers and walked to ridges and spoken truths to Louisa and said things to her aunt that she had never said to anyone. She had written 23 letters and received 23 back, and each one had required her to be more present than the one before. None of this had been Edmund. All of it had happened because of Edmund, which was different. She thought about this in the May evenings when the park was full of the last of the spring blossom, and the air was warm for the first time, and Edmund sat beside her in the garden reading, or simply being present in the way that he was always present, which was entirely and without remainder. She thought, I had been waiting for someone to see me. He did, and then I had to decide what to do with being seen. What she had done was look back. Look at herself with the same direct and patient gaze he had turned on her, and see what was there, not what she hoped was there, not what she had always assumed was there, but what was actually there, including the parts that needed examining. That was the real story, she thought. Not the market and the mistake, not the servant's entrance, not the twist of the unlikely romance. The real story was the looking, the decision to look, and the willingness to keep looking even when what you saw was uncomfortable, and the slow, steady, entirely unglamorous work of becoming someone who saw more clearly. She was still doing that work. She expected she would be doing it for the rest of her life. She was glad. She looked out at the park in the May evening and felt Edmund beside her and felt the rightness of the life she was inside, not as a settled thing, not as a destination reached, but as a direction understood, a heading clear and honest and ongoing. The park was full of the last blossom. The air was warm. The light was going from gold to amber in the way light does in spring evenings, slowly and reluctantly, as if not wanting to stop being beautiful. She breathed it in. She did not think, I should remember this. She simply breathed it and let it be what it was, which was real and present and more than enough. The summer at Harwell Park settled into a rhythm that Clara had not expected to find so quickly, not the rhythm of routine, which is something else, something more mechanical, but the rhythm of a life that fits. She woke at 7 most mornings, earlier in the long summer light when the birds were loud and the park outside the bedroom window looked too alive to sleep through. She walked before breakfast, almost always in the kitchen garden or in the park itself, and she had learned where the best views were at different hours and in different weathers, and she visited them the way you visit things that matter, not habitually but with intention. Edmund was most often already at his desk by the time she came back in. He worked in the morning. The estate required considerable correspondence and regular attention to the ledgers and the farming accounts, and she had come to understand this as a feature of him, not a separation from her but simply a fact of who he was. He was thorough. He did not leave things half done or come back to them later in the vague hope that they would resolve. He finished what he started. She had adopted several of his habits, not by imitation but by proximity, the way you absorb the rhythms of people you live closely alongside without noticing you've done it, until you find yourself doing the same thing. They had the late mornings together, usually, and the afternoons. They took the carriage to York in June, as he had promised in December, the bookshop, the walls, the Natural History Museum, and the coffee, which was excellent. She had stood in the museum for an hour and a half looking at specimens from around the world, not from the polite obligation that had characterized her earlier encounters with improving exhibitions, but from genuine curiosity, asking questions at each case and receiving, from the quiet man at the next case who turned out to be a professor from the university. A 40-minute conversation about the distribution of birds across the northern hemisphere that was one of the best conversations she had had all year, and which left her wanting a great deal more information about birds, specifically, and the world they navigated. "You're going to need more books," Edmund said on the carriage home. "I've always needed more books," she said. "I've only recently started wanting them." He looked at her sideways. "What's the difference?" She thought about it. Needing books is what you do when books are the right thing for someone like you. Wanting them is what you do when you've discovered something specific you want to understand. "And what do you want to understand?" "Everything," she said, simply and without drama, because it was true, and because she no longer needed to say things carefully to avoid appearing too eager or too interested or too certain, which was a relief she felt every day and had stopped fully noticing, the way you stop noticing warmth once you are reliably warm. Edmund looked out the carriage window at the Yorkshire evening going past, the hedgerows, the fields, the old stone walls of the riding country between York and Caldwell. "Good," he said. "That'll keep you busy." She laughed and looked out her own window, and the evening was full of color, going from the last of the afternoon gold into the cooler, longer light of the June evening. And she thought about the Natural History Museum and the birds and the professor and the books she was going to read, and felt the particular pleasure of someone who has discovered that curiosity, properly followed, is not an appetite that diminishes when fed but one that grows. She went back to Caldwell at the end of June, as she had promised herself and her father. She spent a week in the Ashworth house, which had taken on a slightly different quality in her absence, quieter, emptier in certain rooms, but also clearly still her father's house, still his particular arrangement of the world, still warm and orderly and full of Pepper's presence in front of the fire. Pepper had slowed considerably since spring, and she sat beside him on the kitchen floor one morning and stroked his old ears and told him he was a good dog, which he was, and which he had apparently always known, and which she was glad to say plainly. Her father looked well. He had found, since her marriage, a slightly different version of his daily life. The house was quieter without her, which had created a space that he seemed to have filled with more reading and more walks and more dinners with the people he actually liked rather than the people he felt he should invite. He was, she thought, quietly happy in a way that had not been entirely visible to her before, because she had been too close to the surface of his life and too confident that she understood it. "Are you happy?" she asked him one evening over supper, the same question he had asked her in December. He looked at her with the expression she now recognized as his particular version of Edmund's expression, the reading one, the one that meant someone was paying full attention. "Yes," he said, "I am. Are you?" "Yes," she said, "very." "Then we've both managed it," he said, with the dry, uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has worried quietly about his daughter for 23 years and is now at last not worrying. She saw Louisa every day of the week. They walked to the ridge on Tuesday as they had done in January together, and sat on the stile and looked at the valley in its summer version, green and full and warm, completely unlike the bare stripped winter version but recognizably the same view. The town below was the same town. The 4 lanes, the square, the church spire, the grocer's shop where the best apples were still at the front, Mrs. Holt's house with the dyed coat presumably hanging somewhere inside. The cloth stall on market days, where a young woman had been standing in the September of last year when a stranger asked her for directions. "Do you ever think about it?" Louisa said. "The market, September." "Often," Clara said. "Not with guilt exactly, more with interest. It's the most useful mistake I've ever made." "Because of what followed," Louisa said. "Because of what I learned," Clara said. "What followed is wonderful, but the learning would have been worth having even without it. I'd rather have learned it from a kinder situation, but I'm glad I learned it." Louisa was quiet for a moment. Below them, the town went about its Tuesday morning. A cart was moving down the lane past the farriers. The church clock struck 11. "I think," Louisa said carefully, "that you couldn't have learned it from a kinder situation. The learning was about the unkindness. It was about seeing what you did and deciding to be different. A kind situation wouldn't have shown you that." Clara thought about this for a long time, in the way she now thought about things fully, without hurrying to a conclusion. "You might be right," she said. "I usually am," Louisa said, with the mild, straight-faced manner that meant she was being funny but was also being true. They sat on the fence-post stile in the June morning and looked at the valley and said nothing for a while, which was still the best thing Louisa could offer and the thing Clara still valued most. The view was very fine. The morning was warm. 2 women on a fence above a small Yorkshire town, in the summer of 1909, looking at a life from the right height. Exactly the right height. She went back to Harwell Park at the end of the week, on a bright Friday morning, with a bag of gooseberry jam from Mrs. Cooper's stall in the market square. She had stopped and bought it herself, speaking to Mrs. Cooper directly and asking which batch was the freshest, because she was going to compare it with Agnes's and she needed a fair sample. And she arrived at Harwell Park in the afternoon to find Edmund in the park under the old trees with a book. And she walked across the grass to him and he looked up and she sat down beside him on the dry summer ground and told him about the week. And he listened in the way he always listened, and the park was around them and the day was full and warm and entirely specific, and she was, in every particular, entirely herself. She had come a long way from September, not far in miles, not far in time, but far in the way that matters most, which is inward, into the territory of her own honest self, through the uncomfortable country of self-examination and the slow, patient work of choosing to be different. She had been helped. She would always say that plainly because it was true. She had been helped by a man who looked at her clearly from the very first moment and kept looking. She had been helped by a friend who had always seen more than she let on. She had been helped by an aunt who asked the right question. She had been helped by a crow on a fence post, and a ridge above a valley and a Tuesday market, and a wrong answer given to a plainly dressed stranger, and the particular gift of being shown, in the clearest possible way, the exact shape of your own limitations. She had done the work herself, but she had been given the conditions. She was grateful for both. She leaned back in the summer grass and looked up through the canopy of the old trees at the sky, which was the deep blue of a June afternoon at its best, and felt, in that moment, precisely where she was. Which was here, right here, exactly this. Years passed the way years do when you are living inside them well, not quickly exactly, but fully, so that each one had real weight and texture and did not slide past unmarked. Clara counted them not in seasons or anniversaries but in accumulation, in the things she understood that she had not understood before, in the people she knew more deeply, in the growth of the kitchen garden and the increasing authority of Agnes's opinion on everything involving soil, and in the particular quality of her daily life, which remained, year after year, the most honest life she had ever known. She had 2 children. The first arrived in 1910, a girl they named Frances for Clara's mother, and because Edmund had suggested it and she had felt something shift in her chest when he did, the way a thing shifts when it is exactly right. Frances was a determined, observant baby who grew into a determined, observant child with Clara's gray-green eyes and Edmund's quality of stillness, and who showed early the signs of someone for whom the world was primarily a source of information to be gathered rather than a stage to perform on. Clara found this quality in her daughter immediately recognizable and deeply funny, because it was both hers and not hers, the best of what she had been and none of the worst. The second child came in 1912, a boy they named George for her father, who was by then 66 and quietly moved by the honor in the way that men of his generation were moved by things, internally without display and very genuinely. George was entirely unlike his sister, loud, energetic, physically fearless in the way of certain small children, and interested in everything that moved, which at Harwell Park was primarily horses, dogs, and the seasonal changes in the park. He was Edmund's kind of boy, and the two of them moved through the estate together on weekends with a companionable efficiency that Clara watched from a distance and loved in the way you love something that is its own complete thing and does not need you in it. Her father came to Harwell Park for Christmas every year. The Ashworth house had been tenanted and then sold in 1911. Her father had moved to a smaller, quieter house closer to the center of Caldwell, nearer to the people he liked, and with a garden he could manage without assistance. He was well and he was settled, and he and Edmund had developed the particular male friendship of men who respect each other without needing many words for it, conducted primarily over the chess board and the farming ledgers and the occasional bottle of the good wine. Clara watched them together and felt, each time, the same warmth she had felt the first evening Edmund had spoken to her father about the mills, the warmth of two people who are genuinely glad to know each other. Louisa came to Harwell Park twice a year, and Clara went to Caldwell twice a year, and the letters continued every week without exception, and their friendship was, in the years between 1909 and the end of the decade and beyond, the most consistent and honest relationship in Clara's life outside her marriage. Louisa married in 1913 a doctor from Leeds named Henry Marsh, a serious and kind man who, as it turned out, had several things in common with Edmund and who became, in time, a friend of his as well as a relation. They settled in Caldwell, and Louisa's life was Caldwell and the children who came and the garden and the work she did, quietly and without announcement, at the small school in the south part of town, helping the younger children with reading. Clara had not known Louisa did this until she came back to Caldwell for a visit in 1914 and found her friend at the school in the afternoon. She had never asked. She had not thought to ask. "How long have you been doing this?" Clara said on the walk back. 3 years, Louisa said. "You never mentioned it in the letters." Louisa shrugged. "It didn't seem like letter content, it's just a thing I do." Clara thought about this. She thought about the Louisa she had known for most of her life, the one who had agreed with most of what she said, who had laughed easily, who had been her companion without being her mirror. She thought about what else she had not known, or had not asked, or had taken as the whole picture when it was only the part that was shown to her. "Tell me about it," she said. And Louisa did, walking through the Caldwell afternoon, and it was the beginning of a new layer of a friendship that had already been deep, which proved that depth, like everything else worth measuring, does not have a fixed bottom. In the autumn of 1914, the world changed. It changed in the way that large things change, suddenly and completely, and in a way that made the preceding years feel, in retrospect, like a different country. The war that came in August of that year altered everything it touched: the farms, the estate, the town of Caldwell, the families of everyone Clara knew. Edmund was 35, and he did not go. There were considerations of the land and the estate and the farming that kept him essential in ways that many men of his kind found difficult, and that he spoke about only once, briefly and honestly, as the thing he was not going to say more about because saying more would not help. What he did instead was what he had always done. He applied himself fully to what was in front of him, which was the management of a farming estate in wartime, the maintenance of the land, the keeping of the people who depended on it, and the support of Clara, who turned the Harwell Park house into a place that could receive, in the summers of the war years, the children of families in the larger cities who needed to be somewhere else. This was Clara's idea and Edmund's immediate agreement, and they did not discuss it at great length because it was simply the right thing and they both saw it. The children came 6 the first summer, 9 the next, 12 the year after that. They were ranging ages, ranging backgrounds, ranging levels of knowing what they had been sent away from. Agnes had opinions about additional mouths in the kitchen. Mrs. Pound had opinions about the additional washing. Albert Crane had no opinions about the children, specifically, but was seen on several occasions allowing the older boys to come with him on the inspection of the lower fields, and was also seen allowing this to look accidental, which it clearly was not. Clara managed all of this the way she managed most things, directly, without drama, with genuine interest in each child as a specific person, and not as a category of need. She knew which one was afraid of the dark, and which one missed their mother in a way they couldn't talk about, and which one was using loudness to cover confusion. And she responded to each of these things specifically and practically, because she had learned, over years of careful practice, that people, all people at all ages, are best met where they actually are. She wrote to Louisa about the children, and Louisa wrote back with the perspective of someone who taught them. And the letters during the war years were dense with the daily realities of keeping people going, which was the most useful thing Clara could think of to do with her attention, and which she did, winter and summer, without waiting to be told it was admirable. The war ended in 1918. Clara was 33. Edmund was 39. Francis was 8 and George was 6, and the estate had lost 2 of its farm workers and the lodge-keeper's eldest son and the younger of the 2 men who worked in the kitchen garden. And these losses were specific and real and not at all abstract, and they grieved them in the specific, real way that Edmund had always grieved things fully, without performance, and without pretending that the grief was not there. The years after the war were the years in which Clara came into the fullest version of herself. She was involved with the estate in ways that went beyond the household. She sat with Edmund over the farming accounts and contributed to the decisions, not because he needed a second opinion, but because she had a genuine understanding of the economics of the land by now, and because they found, in the work, a particular closeness. The closeness of 2 people who are genuinely engaged in the same things for the same reasons. She was involved with the school in Caldwell, following Louisa's lead, not in the teaching but in the governance, the kind of involvement that required her to sit on committees and speak in rooms where people who had not expected her opinion discovered she had won. She did this without aggression and without performance. She simply turned up and contributed and left when the meeting was over, which was more effective than either of the alternatives. She read constantly. The library at Harwell Park grew by a shelf a year on average, and not all of it was Edmund's doing. She read about birds, which she had begun in the Natural History Museum in York, and about the natural world more broadly, and about history, and about the parts of the world she had not visited and now had no particular expectation of visiting but wanted to understand. She read about people, in the form of letters and memoirs, and the kind of biography that does not romanticize its subject, but attempts to see them clearly. She read about people and she looked at people and she spoke to people as they were, not as she had decided they were in the first 10 seconds. This was not something she ever finished learning. It was a practice in the religious sense, something you return to daily and approach with humility, knowing you will not always manage it, and also that the not managing is part of the practice. In 1921, she told the story for the first time. Not to a room full of people, not as an anecdote at a dinner party, but to Francis, who was 11, the age Clara had been when her mother died, and who had come home from the village school in a state of uncharacteristic distress, because she had been unkind to a girl whose family had moved to the area from the north, and had felt the unkindness immediately after the fact, and was now sitting at the kitchen table unable to explain what she had done or why. Clara sat across from her daughter and listened to the whole story, which took some time because Francis was crying quietly through parts of it, and when it was done, Clara said, "Let me tell you something that happened to me." She told Francis about the market, about September and the Tuesday morning, and the man with mud on his boots who had asked for directions. She told it simply and plainly, in the way she had come to understand the story by telling it to herself, which was, a young woman made a quick decision about a person based on the wrong information, and the consequences of that decision turned out to be the most important education of her life. Francis listened with the same quality of attention she always brought to things, still and full, taking it in. When Clara finished, she said, "And he came back anyway." "He did," Clara said. "Why?" Francis said. Clara thought about this. She had thought about it many times in many forms, and each time she came back to the same answer, which was not a dramatic one but which she believed was true. "Because he was interested in who I might be," she said, "not just in who I was that morning." Francis looked at her for a moment with Edmund's eyes, and Clara's mind working behind them. "And you married him," she said. 12 years ago," Clara said, "in the church in Caldwell on a morning in April when the valley was very green." Francis sat quietly for a while, then she said, "I should go and apologize to the girl." "You should," Clara said, "not to make yourself feel better, to make things right." "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Clara said, "a significant one. The first is for you. The second is for her." Francis looked at her mother with that expression, the reading one, the one that meant full attention, and then she pushed back her chair and went to get her coat. Clara sat in the kitchen after she left and heard the front door close, and sat in the quiet for a while. Through the window, the November park was bare and gray and specific in the way that November things are specific, every branch visible, every detail of the old trees clear against the pale sky. She had looked at this park in every season. She knew which tree lost its leaves last and which ones held berries into January, and where the snowdrops came in February, the earliest of anything, pushing through the cold ground with that particular stubbornness that she had always found, and still found, moving. She thought about the market. She thought about it the way she had always thought about it, which was not with the flinch of embarrassment, but with the clear-eyed recognition of someone who has looked at a thing so many times that it no longer has power over her, but retains all of its meaning. She had done something unkind. She had done it quickly and without thought, and the man she had done it to had been, of all the people she might have done it to, the man she was going to marry. She had sorted him in 10 seconds into the wrong category, and the error had been visible to everyone who witnessed it, to Louisa, certainly, and to Edmund, and possibly to one or two others in the market square who had been close enough to hear. She had learned from it, she had changed because of it. She had become, in the years since that September morning, a person who was more present, more honest, more genuinely interested in the people around her, and less concerned with the comfortable altitude of her own unexamined certainties. She was not finished becoming that person. She expected she never would be. She was glad of the learning. She had said this to Louisa on the ridge in June of 1909, and she had believed it then, and she believed it now more deeply and with more evidence. The learning had cost her something, the comfortable version of herself, the version that had been safe and correct and rather sealed, and what it had given her in return was not just Edmund and the life they had built, but the capacity to live that life fully, which was the better gift of the two. Edmund came in from the park at 4:30, in from his afternoon walk, and found her still at the kitchen table. He came in and looked at her, and she told him about Francis and the apology, and he sat down and listened with his whole attention in the way he always did, and when she finished he said, "She'll be all right." "She will," Clara said. She knew immediately that she'd done something wrong. "That's more than I managed at her age." "You managed it eventually," he said. "Better late than not at all," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the expression she had first seen at a market stall and could not read and now read as clearly as her own handwriting. It said, "I see you, all of you, and I am, as I have always been since the very first morning, entirely glad." She looked back at him in the November kitchen in the house she had made her home, and felt the years between September 1908 and this particular afternoon as the specific, real weight of a life properly lived, imperfectly, and with many corrections, and always in the direction of more honesty, more clarity, more genuine interest in the real size of things. Outside, through the window, Frances was crossing the park in her coat, heading toward the village with the purposeful walk of a girl who has decided to make something right, and is not going to stop until she does. Clara watched her go. She was in her daughter's walk more herself than she had ever been at 11, or at 23, or even perhaps at 33, and this made Clara feel not proud, not satisfied, nothing so complete as that, but glad. Simply, fully, honestly glad. She turned back to the room. The kitchen was warm. The afternoon was going dark outside. Edmund was there. The house was around them, old and comfortable and full of the accumulated living of many years. Pepper was long gone, but there was a dog now, a young spaniel named Monday, who was asleep by the range in the exact position Pepper had always occupied, as if the spot itself were inherited. Edmund poured them both a cup of the tea that had been sitting on the range, and they sat at the kitchen table together in the November afternoon, and the tea was warm, and the room was quiet, and outside the last of the light was going from the park. She thought, this is what it looks like, from the correct height. This is what happens when you stop looking from a long way up and come down and stand where things are the size they actually are. It looks like this. A kitchen, a table, a cup of tea, a man who looked at you clearly from the very first moment and never stopped. It looks, in other words, like everything.